one obstacle to building high quality phenomenology is people's kind of like obsession or attachment or clinging to the semantic content, to the aboutness of the experience, and neglecting the character, like what it actually felt like. For me, like the very classic kind of like archetypical description of this, for example, is, let's say after a DMT experience, it's very common for people to say, I saw clowns, right? Or like I saw these gestures and so on. So that is like the aboutness. That's semantic content. Like if you say I went into a circus and there was a lion, that is like about, it's like, what was the experience about? But look, like you can smoke salvia and have an experience of seeing gestures and a dragon and a lion, but it's a completely different experience, right? So, to begin with, that's one of the reasons I'm like super skeptical when people say like, especially people who haven't done a lot of DMT, like they will say like, oh, everybody sees the same on DMT. Is like, really? Like I've had like over 1,000 trips, and like I don't know if I've seen exactly the same in any of those trips. And like,
Andres, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, man, this was a long awaited conversation for myself and for many of my listeners. You are, as Michael described you off camera when we spoke, he said he's such an original thinker. I think it's a really good way of describing you. I never know, or I'm never sure what you're going to say next, and that's the best quality in a public intellectual. That conversation you had with Josh Abar, you and him, there's a few others, but you definitely up there with my favorite thinkers that are still alive today. So that was such a wonderful conversation. I highly recommend everybody watch it on your channel. To anybody who doesn't know, you are the founder of Qualia Research Institute, QRI, and your background is, mathematics mostly. Is that correct?
A bit complicated. Also, I should clarify co-founder, because we were three who made it happen originally. Yes.
Sure. And your guys' main focus is to basically investigate consciousness from the perspective of what modalities we can actually utilize to say something a little bit more concrete about it than just kind of consciousness. And you guys approaching it from all kinds of angles. Testing it computationally, mathematically, topologically, taking into account all of the phenomenology of altered states and regular states, and what we can say from the perspective of what neuroscience knows. So it's a really vast and robust kind of work. And I think that, considering the content I usually produce, it should be a very interesting conversation. My personal interest, as I told you just off camera, when I was trying to prepare for this podcast and consolidate all the things that I can potentially want to ask you, it was very difficult because there's so many different avenues that I want to explore. So I managed to dial it into something that I think we can cover in a podcast, which gives me confidence that we might be able to solve the hard problem of consciousness by the end of this conversation. So then we can just sit zazen forever. Okay, so let me dive right into it with a couple of warm up questions. In people can check out your channel, Qualia Research Institute, and also just the website, and obviously all the links are going to be below. So I want to actually explore the conversation, like your work, through the questions, not necessarily give an exposition of like all the details of how you see yourself and what you do. One of the first things that I managed to dial into, one of the central questions I want to ask you is maybe set up the stage in general, but like perception in general. Would you consider yourself more of an idealist in general, or?
Would I classify that as a question about perception? I would classify that question as a question about ontology or metaphysics. And I would say idealist is pretty close, yes. I'm not a materialist. If we define materialism as, hey, the world is made of atoms and forces, and that's it. And the atoms and forces are insentient. They don't have consciousness. Consciousness is emergent. I do not believe that. I think that the fundamental nature of reality has qualia and potentiality in it, and in fact, I think you really need to understand consciousness ultimately if you want to understand physics, as opposed to like only the other way around. So yes, yeah. In other words, I think like the universe is made of consciousness, and what the laws of physics are describing is the behavior of consciousness from the point of view of an external observer.
And what is that? What even is that, right? Like, what is an external observer? That, to me, it seems like all the questions that people try to look. So, okay. So, for example, in your conversation with Joshua, right? So, like, um, every thinker, including the ones that I deeply respect and love listening to, they always have this one point where I identify it as either the jump or the bait and switch, right? And sometimes they knowingly are doing that and admittedly doing that, and sometimes they don't even realize they're doing that. And
Yeah.
the jump is basically they kind of, they have a logical progression of everything they're saying, and then somewhere in there there's smuggled like but there's magic happens, and then it's usually the tail sign of the jump is when the word just is utilized. So then it's just like, and that is just naturally occurring, or just whatever it is. I always say, let's agree to not use the word just, because it means nothing in reality. And for example, so I'll give you an example where I feel that Joshua, how do you pronounce his name? Joshua, right?
Joshua.
Yeah, where I feel that he commits the jump is that when his whole, well, not whole thing, but one of his biggest theories is that consciousness, what we are as a conscious being, is basically just the story the system tells itself. It's the software story, so to speak. Now, there's obviously a lot more details there, but at no point is it justified to just, if we're starting from scratch, and that's what we're assuming to do if we're really trying to understand this thing, I don't feel like it's justified to say, well, that thing that where I'm pointing to, you might say, well, here's the mechanisms I think I understand about it, but it's not quite the same as saying that's what causes that quality of perception to arise in it. So the way that I'm, just to give you the kind of like the way that I managed to dial it in for myself in a sentence, and basically the situation is that it's a representation of representation to representation, and the to representation part is really the hard problem of consciousness. And what I feel is happening very often is that people kind of just do the first two. They do representation, they talk a lot about that, the details and all of that, and then also, well, it's recursive, so it talks about itself, but they never talk about this part of like, what is this two? Like, why is all of a sudden there's this perception, right? Now, obviously, that's, we're not going to answer this, but I want to use this as a jumping board when you're thinking about these very complex problems. When you take into account all the phenomenology you're aware of and you investigate it from a quote-unquote third-person perspective, does the intuitive portion of what it's like to maybe be that perception follows you the whole way in your way of thinking, or sometimes you just allow yourself to just focus on just the mathematics or just the models and then see if it somehow matches some kind of an intuition you have at the end?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I am very intuition driven, and I mean, a lot of my research aesthetic, which I think is actually maybe one of the things that makes QRI powerful is not even, it's not its resources, it's not like particularly, like some of the empirical results, but I think it's like really the research aesthetic. It's just like, okay, like how to choose something actually interesting to focus on. It is very driven by phenomenology. It is like, okay, I've had like, hundreds, thousands of experiences with exotic phenomenology. And that informs me like, okay, like what is actually likely to produce like interesting results. And also what kind of modeling may actually be helpful here. So I think it's very rare that I will, let's say, just be heads down, like solving an algebraic equation completely disconnected from like what I think that is representing. And then just kind of like finding a miraculous match. It really more, this is also the case in physics. I mean, like most of the great physicists, usually they will describe it as having on the one hand, powerful mathematical horsepower versus having the physical intuition. And what often happens with very complicated physical systems is that you either have one or the other, and it's but it's usually when you have both when you can actually make progress. They're like, you know how the equations work, but then also you know really what they refer to. So you have like a sense of like what they're supposed to look like, and you can detect the mistakes you may be doing in the math itself. I don't know if that answers your question, or
It
maybe...
does. It does.
Okay,
No,
okay.
you basically, yeah, it absolutely does. I guess to me, it's always you. I think you nailed it right on the head. The access to certain kinds of perceptions is always the initial step we're taking, even if we don't realize it. I do think that to some degree, in the regular material science, or like especially in physics, something happens there to physicists when they're being, not going to use the word indoctrinated, but when they learn that physics is done this way, and we want to remove ourselves as the observer as much as possible. There's what is smuggled in. There's, I feel, a kind of bias that is actually it's counterproductive, because it completely neglects the fact that yes, we want to have as much of our personal point of view playing less of a role, so people who are highly technically minded can agree on something more shared, but at the same time, without the having the originally the senses that could perceive the things that we're studying, then adjacently, eyes, ears, all that stuff. Right now, there's so many things happening, and we know this also from psychedelic spaces, that if they do have some reality to themselves, well, you can miss quite a bit just because you didn't have this first entry point into that space, right?
Yeah.
So and I feel like, well, okay, so let's maybe frame this in a form of a question. I think that there's certain models that you bring into the picture that I find particularly interesting, especially when you're having these conversations with other scientists who are studying maybe a little bit more in a mainstream way, even though I tend to watch a lot of fun interviews with you and discovering that there's a lot of people in mainstream that are pretty open to these kind of new forms of thinking, which is very encouraging.
Oh, yes.
Do you ever encounter the situation where it seems like the person simply have never experienced that before, and therefore you have to traverse some kind of a conceptual bridge that maybe isn't traversable because they simply have to first have that experience, which of course is not a scientific way of talking about it, right? But when you encounter that, how do you reconcile this? Do you just use your technical prowess to just try and kind of bypass this?
It is a great question, and there's no all-size-fit-all answer. But let me give you some pointers. So, for example, for like physics education, I am like quite sympathetic to some degree of, for example, the professor, the teacher saying like, hey, hold your horses. Like, don't bring your intuition quite yet, right? Because you actually don't know what this is about. Like, there's this very beautiful quote of like Richard Feynman, famous physicist, Nobel Prize winner, and developer of quantum theory. It's kind of like they ask him like, okay, what is an electron? Like, is it a wave? Is it a particle? And he says like, well, electrons act like waves. No, not exactly, right? Or like, do they act like particles? No, not exactly, right? Like they act like, and he's like, oh, it's beyond human intuition, but no, not quite either, because the way to develop an intuition of how electrons actually behave is you can actually, plug the equations of physics in simulations and then like stare for hours of like, okay, how does an electron system behave in this box with this shape, or when they interact at this level of energy? And yes, you look at the simulations, and I encourage people to look online for like, okay, quantum simulations of the Schrodinger equation applied to electrons. Is like, well, yeah, it sometimes looks like waves and sometimes looks like particle, but it's like a different kind of third thing. But it's not these like completely mysterious, you will never have any intuition for. It's like, no, you just need to actually look at the simulations and like really pay attention to them. And then, okay, yes, you create this category of like electron-like behavior. You realize that waves and particle was a placeholder until you really had the exposure and the experience. It's something similar. You can talk about like LSD experiences with people who've never had a psychedelic experience. And there's something like that, you might be saying like, well, yeah, the walls were kind of melting, but not quite, right? And there were waves, but not waves like in the ocean, but another type of waves that are they're kind of like the space was fragmenting, but not like, and And people is like, okay, but what is it exactly? It's like, well, it is its own thing, but it does have equations and like it does follow predictable patterns. It's just you really need kind of like exposure to the phenomenon, or at the very least, like very high quality simulations of it to actually know what you're talking about. And one thing that is very common is illusion of understanding, especially when it comes to, like, for example, the range of consciousness, range of hedonic experiences. I'll give you a very simple example. People are often under the illusion that they know what, let's say, depression or anxiety are, because, well, they had like a bad day, versus like, well, no, okay, like clinical depression is like, it's a different qualia and it's like orders of magnitude worse than what most people like conceive of. The same with like extreme pain, the same with extreme psychedelic experiences, right? It's like you may think you have an idea what the other person is talking about, and oftentimes it's like you're not even close, or like not even remotely. It is also very often the case that, yeah, people don't want to hear that. They don't want to maybe acknowledge, okay, like their experience is not very vast. They want to work with what they do know, be part of the be part of the party, as it were. And there are some things where legitimately, at least at the frontier of science, like I think first person experience is really required. It will not be required forever. I mean, like, just as you don't need to be, a lab technician doing experiments on electrons nowadays to work on electrons, right? Because you can play with simulations. I think it's going to be the same with some aspects of consciousness. So that, like, yes, once we hone in on the equations of, for example, the LSD state of consciousness, you probably won't need to do LSD in order to advance some areas of that, some branches of that science. You will probably still need to do LSD to advance other areas, especially those that have not been modeled quite yet. You will also, nonetheless, you will probably be able to have like very sober scientists derive predictions based on a theory that then, for example, psychonauts might be able to confirm or deny. And so it is not like, hey, just because you don't have experience, you can't participate in the science. But it is true that at the very least right now, at the frontier of knowledge, it really is kind of like a night and day situation. And, the people we invite to the QRI legal psychedelic retreats, really they're a combination of like very advanced, people in very advanced technical fields with advanced degrees and capabilities and skills, but also very experienced with these exotic states of consciousness, advanced meditators and advanced psychonauts. And I think that, yeah, like the really efficient pursuit for the truth happens at the intersection of like, well, you have like a lot of personal experience and a lot of technical knowledge. And that's where like, okay, that can pierce things that look impossible to penetrate, as it were.
Is it possible, and you touched on something very interesting that I thought about quite a bit, which is the description problem. So like taking something and representing it symbolically, right? Which is a huge portion of what you're trying to figure out with QRI. And I would say that to me, I'm open to the idea that it might be certain that might lend credence to this very annoying statement that people sometimes make in more esoteric and contemplative and meditative circles. It was like, you can't really represent the truth symbolically. And I thought about this a little bit more, like from a slightly more technical perspective. I want to see what you think about that. I did encounter, I've never tried jhana meditation. What is it? How you pronounce it?
Yeah, jhana meditation.
Jhana, I never know how to pronounce it correctly. But I did quite a bit of Vipassana, and I did encounter these situations where the totality of what the experience presents itself to be, kind of like the truth about it, if you try to represent it in some linguistic form, even to yourself, it kind of evaporates. So one thing you can say, well, maybe it wasn't even a truth then. The other thing tells me that maybe there's something about certain portions of truths about reality that might only be represented in their totality. And the second you try and take one bit away to represent it in that bit, it's no longer available to you to be perceived. Are you open to these kinds of truths maybe existing in reality?
Yeah, and yes, I mean, yes, and can absolutely like steelman your case. I mean, I'll give you an extreme example, which is I know a girl who's incredibly sweet and incredibly smart and talented and quite autistic. Not maybe I don't know. There's like not non-verbal, but significantly autistic and absolutely lovely presence. what's fascinating is that she describes that until she was like 25 years old, all of her experience of the world, you know the expression like missing the forest because you're caught up on the trees, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like she said, like her life was like that, but like at a base sensory level, in that like she wouldn't perceive faces. She would see like, oh, there's a nose, there's like some eyes. The face would not actually form as a gestalt. Um, you know, if you're in that state, there is something you're missing about, you know, what consciousness can do. That I don't think like the intellect can bridge, right? Like or other exemplars can bridge. In her case, very interestingly, she started doing you know, various kinds of meditation therapy and exploring with psilocybin mushrooms in a legal context, and with therapists, and actually, you know, she developed the ability to experience gestalts thanks to that therapy. Is the only person I've ever known who's done that transition, and it's fascinating that it happened via mushrooms and meditation in the right setting. And she can actually now perceive like gestalts, visual, you know, like faces, and even things such as like the sense of like a group of a person, like that is very common with, for example, like autism, right? It's like you perceive people as individuals and you don't perceive the group consciousness or the group kind of tribal quality of
The
maybe a
groups
group.
want, yeah.
Yeah, whereas, you know, a neurotypical, that is like super basic. Qualia is like, okay, from the age of 5 years old, like you tune into that because we're chimpanzees and we need that to survive. But in her case, yeah, like it was only after mushrooms she was able to kind of like start perceiving social information that way. You know, that sort of thing is where I would say like, okay, yes, that might be impossible to communicate. However, for other things, I actually think like, you know, very high quality, very advanced phenomenologists, who are creative and can like draw from different areas of knowledge and phenomenology to try to guess what something might feel like, actually sometimes like make, I think, like surprisingly close description. I'll give you an example. Like I would describe 5-MeO DMT as a mixture of 4 drugs. My lighter just ran out, but for a mixture of 4 drugs. This is not the full 5-MeO experience, but it's a big chunk of it, which is I describe 5-MeO as like a kind of mixture of a DMT, because it's kind of this hyperdimensional, super high frequency phenomenon, a very fine high frequency, spatial and temporal. Nitrous oxide, because it's kind of this like, hey, lowering of the register, like dissociation, kind of little cocoon type of experience, softness, anesthetic quality. Poppers or amyl nitrate for this kind of like flushing sensation in the body. And an MDMA because of the powerful universal love that is like very often present, that is very characteristically serotonergic. You know, if I describe that to somebody I know who's deeply experienced with these substances, and then they try 5-MeO, often, you know, when I've actually described this, they will say, yes, actually, you did give me a bit of an idea of like what low dose 5-MeO was like. And it was not as surprising. Now, high dose 5-MeO, I don't know how to describe it, because it does become something.
The egg hatches and then the dragon comes out. It's completely different.
Yeah. It turns into something else. But let's say up to like 4 milligrams or something like that is like, this is evocative enough that like I am comfortable saying like, okay, that gives you an idea of what that qualia is. Even though there is a gestalt involved, like legitimately 5-MeO is more than the sum of those parts, but it gives you an idea. I guess like what I want to say is like, I frame a lot of what I say in terms of like epistemological optimism, that like usually when somebody says, oh, you can't do this, oftentimes I think like, well, maybe you can't really, but like you can get like 90% of the way there if you're creative enough and like you combine enough information from different fields.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. And you know, the thrust behind my question is, well, it's a fewfold, but one of the main things I'm really interested in how do you cross these bridges? And in order to understand that, you have to kind of think about what is the distance you actually have to travel, right? Which is a very difficult question, because you don't even know what. Sometimes they belong to completely different groups where they're so orthogonal that you can't really know even when to look. It's almost like you're looking from an infinite possibility space of how they relate to one another. Another thing beautiful thing you guys talked about with Yasha is that how things consolidate themselves in the brain is partially also the result of the brain is doing the consolidation between, let's say, sound and light and things like this. But if you're sampling from what we postulate to be an infinite space of possibilities, which we're never in really. But what I really wonder is there something to be said then, especially when we're talking about consciousness or fundamental things in reality? I feel like maybe there should be more of an emphasis between the interlocutors to maybe check with the other if the axioms are even the same here. Because very often I feel like people kind of talking past each other because they just, they simply never had that quality, and the other person, it never even occurred to them that maybe for them it's different. And that's the thing that I'm always staying very sensitive to. Something you guys, I really wanted to touch on, but somewhat related. It was a really interesting idea that you guys talked about, which is that when you, I think Yasha basically voiced it, and I really like your thoughts on that, and I want you to recapitulate some of them. Basically, his idea was that basically what happens with these psychedelics is that they kind of or a different state. So, like for example, also he specifically was talking about the context originally of people on the spectrum, and then he said that he thinks that what might be going on is that there's less of an interaction between the layers of modeling in the brain, and they can only interact with the thing right here, but they can't really model very deeply. And the opposite happens with artists because they overmodel, right? And then these connections, they become too robust, and they just kind of go through when they were supposed to stop here. Yeah. And I found this particularly interesting in the context of psychedelics, because I thought, well, what if what happens on mushrooms, for example, is that they do also relax, because we do know that they reduce some activity in the DMN. Maybe they do reduce some higher model like building, like assumptions about a world, the thing that consolidates it into normality that helps us operate in three-dimensional space. And then what you get is really, because there's bandwidth of how much of whatever attention is you can actually put on things, there's more of the bandwidth to put onto the quality of the things that built the image to begin with. That's why colors are more, because red is redder. It's more of the essence of whatever red, however it is represented in the brain. And I don't know if there is any connection, but I wanted to specifically look at that problem through your model of liquid crystals. Mm-hmm. Because I have to admit that I think I understand it to a degree, but from everything you say, that's the thing that I'm having the hardest time actually visualizing. And maybe this is an instance of one of these cases where maybe I am missing some qualia. Yeah. And I would love to see if you can help me cross that bridge. And then in the context of everything else I just said.
Yeah, the liquid crystals thing is something I would like to build towards. And there's maybe 5 or so pieces of the puzzle before like that even makes sense. So, but I'm very happy to go through them, because this is actually really core to what we're doing these days, and our work output of this year actually. Like, let me share first a couple kind of like basic pointers for phenomenological investigation, and then like let's go maybe through a couple of the building blocks so that we can get to the liquid crystals.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the first one is, this is like, we can call it like classic QRI, since 2016, you can find me talking about this. I mean, QRI really has like a number of arcs where like it was like, the pre-QRI era, QRI 1.0, 2.0. We're kind of like in QRI 3.0, which is like post the psychedelic retreats, and like when we're doing like actual software simulations and doing like peer-reviewed papers and stuff. And it's a very different feel than like QRI.
What part was it when your really viral video from Harvard went crazy viral? What part of that was that?
That was like
pre-QRI, or
that was the like that video. I would describe it like the transition to QRI 2.0.
Okay.
Where we started to have like interns and actually grow as an organization. Like before that, we were just a couple cats like writing blog posts, essentially. To be honest,
great. Yeah.
I mean, like,
was it in a garage? It has to be in a garage.
I would be lying to you if I said it was in a garage, but let's say like not in an office.
Okay.
No, actually, no. Forget about it. It was in an office. Like actually, QRI 1.0 was like, I was like a full-time data scientist and working 8 hours a day on like writing software to analyze engagement surveys, performance reviews with natural language processing, and then I would get back home and then like write about consciousness for like a couple hours and then go to sleep. And but a lot of the thinking happened in an office. But anyway, that's a sidetrack. there are like some core things from QRI 1.0. You could say that are really foundational, I think, like to really make progress. So the first point is what we call like the distinction between the intentional content and the phenomenal character of an experience. And intentional content is maybe it's a little bit deceptive or misleading because it's intentionality in the philosophical sense and not in the colloquial sense. And that was written for like analytic philosophers rather than a lay audience. I would describe it more kind of like the difference between for a broad audience. I would describe like the difference between the aboutness of an experience and the what does it feel like of an experience. And what we find is that one obstacle to building high quality phenomenology is people's kind of like obsession or attachment or clinging to the semantic content, to the aboutness of the experience, and neglecting the character, like what it actually felt like. For me, like the very classic kind of like archetypical description of this, for example, is let's say after a DMT experience, it's very common for people to say, I saw clowns, right? Or like I saw these gestures and so on. So that is like the aboutness. That's semantic content. Like if you say I went into a circus and there was a lion, that is like about. It's like what was the experience about? But look, like you can smoke salvia and have an experience of seeing gestures and a dragon and a lion, but it's a completely different experience, right? So to begin with, that's one of the reasons I'm like super skeptical when people say like especially people who haven't done a lot of DMT, like they will say like, oh, everybody sees the same on DMT. Is like, really? Like I've had like over 1,000 trips and like I don't know if I've seen exactly the same in any of those trips. And like what are you talking about? Like there's some consistency for sure, but like it's definitely not like the naive view of like, hey, did you see the blue jester? Like the blue jester is like, it's like, no, it doesn't work that way. However, what I would say is like highly productive description of this phenomenology is, for example, if you trained yourself to detect the frequency of a flickering light, there's like these like stroboscopic stimulation systems, and you can dial in, hey, I want like 10 hertz, I want 15 hertz. You can train yourself to like at a glance be able to say like, I think that's like 20 hertz, and let's say be accurate within like plus minus 2 or something like that. Okay, if you have that skill, that's fantastic, because then when you're on DMT and you look at the gesture, you can say, okay, but what was the flickering frequency of their clothes relative to the background? And if you bring those numbers, that information, that is the sort of thing that I think can like crisply distinguish between, well, were you on salvia or were you on 5-MeO or on DMT? Because the flicker lights on DMT are very high frequency. They're like 20 to 30 hertz, whereas like salvia is more like 10 hertz, and it has like this weird wave envelope that drags the frames in uncomfortable ways. And just from the flicker frequency, you could already kind of like separate these two phenomenologies. Now, a more advanced kind of description of the phenomenal character or the structural elements of the experience, or more sophisticated things such as like, hey, like looking at the texture, like for example, the texture behind me, right? Like that one is one of these like mirror symmetries that.
Oh no, I thought you wanted to
say wallpaper symmetry group. So the wallpaper symmetry groups are kind of like these like repeating patterns that like tessellate a space, and they have like names like star 442 or like 222 or 333, what they're describing is like what symmetries are present in the system. I guess as an exercise, I'm not going to tell you which one is this. So if in the comments you guys like try to guess, and I'll see if you guys.
What do the numbers denote specifically?
Yeah, what the numbers denote is the symmetry elements present in the scene. So here's the like a super basic introduction is, okay. So here's a pentagon, right? So a pentagon is very interesting because like you can rotate it 5 times and it looks the same, right?
So it's a rotational symmetry of 5.
Yes. So this is 5-fold rotational symmetry. But there's an additional component here, which is that it also has a mirror, right? Like you can also mirror it and it looks the same.
7.
So this actually would be in wallpaper symmetry group notation, this would be described as like star 5. Because
why not 7? Because if you do the mirroring does not count as a number, or it's a
No, because you wanna keep like the number of rotations, and you wanna consider the mirroring another symmetry operation, so that you don't confuse like a seventh
Got it.
rotational a
So
heptagon, for
mirror
example.
mirror two because you can do this and this, but it's really infinite dimensional. Oh, on two
No,
axes. Yeah,
there's only one way of mirroring something,
got it.
and the technical description is like an asterisk, at least in this notation. So these would be like an asterisk 5 as a symmetry element. So if you see this, for example, in a fullerene, like in a football soccer
Baxter
ball,
Fall. Yeah, buckyballs. Yeah.
exactly like that has a star 5 symmetry element in its description, because you can take that ball and you can rotate it 5 times and it looks the same, and you can also mirror it in 5 different ways and it also looks the same. So
So is it, just as quick side question? So Lie groups, they have everything to do with that. They're just kind of like trend rotation symmetries and just symmetries in general.
Lie groups, I mean, it's a whole conversation. The Lie
Okay.
groups. The one thing I'll note is like Lie groups really refer to like continuous symmetries. So, for example, like a sphere would be described in terms of a specific Lie group, because a sphere you can like rotate it this way, you can rotate it this way, and this way, and any of those rotations, any angle you choose, it will look the same. Does that make sense?
That's the
And also,
continuous part, exactly.
and
Yeah.
also you can reflect it. You can reflect a sphere, and it looks the same, which is different than a pentagon, right? Like if you add like 1 degree to the pentagon and rotation, it just is a different shape. So when you have like these like smooth symmetries, that is Lie groups. And so Lie groups actually are relevant for psychedelic phenomenology, but I would argue specifically for 5-MeO DMT phenomenology, where the symmetries are smooth, right? Like DMT is always like angular and like always geometric, and there's like you can't just rotate a little bit and it looks the same. It's always going to be kind of like in discrete chunks. Whereas like 5-MeO is these like smooth continuous symmetries. So anyway,
It's almost the opposite in that way, actually, to me.
Oh, really?
It's almost like, yeah, but like, and then just feels more like infinite content. So like angles and like, so it divides itself into more and more and more, where with 5-MeO, it feels more and more and more unitary, more continuous, more, so in that sense, at least, they feel completely opposed.
Yeah.
But sorry, I cut your train of thought. Continue, please.
Yeah. No, I mean, so let's say like early on, for example, like back in 2016, like I in breaks where I was in Mexico, like at retreat facilities, like taking mushrooms in I actually was like in the context of like trying to know like what is like a traditional like Mazatec like psilocybin ceremony, and etc. But like part of what I would do is like I would like close my eyes and just like wait for the patterns to form. And then because I had trained myself to be able to name those patterns, I could say like, oh, now I'm seeing the star 442 symmetry. Now I'm seeing the 222. And I would take note. And what happened is that after a couple of experiences, I actually kind of collected them all. Like all of the symmetries, at some point I encountered them naturally, which to me was a revelation. Right? Like it meant that, hey, the visual system is capable of self-generating any mathematical symmetry. Is not constrained by, hey, can only do like 3 rotational symmetries or 4 rotational symmetries. It's a general symmetry engine. And then on top of that, if you look at the geometry of DMT, precisely like, hey, if you see a gesture, typically the gesture will have like kind of like checkerboard patterns. So like it will be like field or pentagons or heptagons and stuff like that. And if you're quick and if you have trained yourself, you can also name that, and you can say like, wow, you have like the star 442 symmetry on your clothing. And I actually think like that is really useful information to report, and it's like scientifically valuable. Other people can confirm. Now, if everybody sees like star 442, then I would say like, yes, people see the same thing on DMT, but not if you say everybody sees a clown, because a clown is like, it could be so many different emotions and feelings. And
it's almost like the physics of the psychedelic space. One of my biggest gripe is too strong, but one of my biggest kind of like conundrums with how DMTX went about it with the first round, at least, is these reporting of meeting beings and trying to discern information from it. And I was like, it's the worst kind of evidence even in court of law. Like how you talking about psychedelic space, why not focus on the space?
Yeah.
Which is exactly what you're saying. But
Yeah.
obviously I wouldn't know even how to begin to think about how to analyze the space. That's brilliant. So symmetries, you focus on symmetries because it had this slightly more universal component, because there's something about the way the substance metabolizes in your brain, even if you want to look at it from the most kind of like simpleton physicalist perspective, there's something about that is universal for everybody, and then whatever content comes is painted on top of these frequencies. So if you can notice the frequencies, you can say something that you can do something with because it's across individuals. Would that be an accurate? Okay.
Yeah. Let me give you also two very concrete examples of like how this cashes out into something useful. So the first one was like how I discovered like DMT it produces hyperbolic geometry. Because I had heard Terence McKenna saying like, hey, the shapes the machine elves give you are impossible shapes. What do you mean it's impossible? Like if you're experiencing it, clearly it's not impossible. Now, it is impossible, but in our geometry.
Euclidean space, yeah.
Euclidean space. So here's how I first actually stumbled. Oh, actually, yeah, you see this. Those are the 17 wallpaper symmetry groups. So people just Google it and like learn about this. It's life enriching. What I was gonna say is like I went like in a
because this is a fun part for people, I think, to partake in. Are you suggesting that if people study these and create some intuitions around them, this and the symmetry groups, they should have some interesting ability to maybe kind of find their own coordinates in that space? So they kind of know how far, how much of the volume of the thing there is. That's actually a really fun. You guys, I'm not saying you guys should try this at home, but maybe if you live where it's legal, maybe you should try this at home.
Yeah. I mean no, exactly. I would argue, and we're in the process of like developing the experimental paradigms to confirm this. But I would argue that you can crisply determine the level of DMT somebody went to just based on the geometric patterns that they were able to experience. And I don't mean it in the sense of like, oh, you met the magic crystal that exists in level 3. Like, no, I mean it in the sense of like, it doesn't matter if you're seeing like mantis or if you're seeing like animals or whatever. The question is like, how many angles were at the intersections between these shapes? And the concrete example I was trying to explain is that in one experience, ayahuasca also in one of these retreats was like, I was in the middle of a palace, a gigantic palace, these beautiful kind of heaven realm type experiences, and I saw that the walls were covered with heptagons. I mean, that's a little bit misleading because it's not like, oh, it's just a heptagon. It's like, and they're like static because they're always like shifting and moving, right? But I could tell it had like 7-fold symmetry. That like it was a pattern that you can rotate 7 times and it looked the same.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, wow, this is incredible. But then when I came down, I realized, hold on a second, that's impossible. Like you cannot actually do that. Like you can only do, like in our space, you can only do. You can only tessellate something with triangles, squares, or hexagons. You cannot tessellate something with heptagons because the angles add up to more than 360 degrees. And then it's like, wait, hold on a second. It is possible, but only if you're in hyperbolic geometry. Like I was in hyperbolic geometry. And it was like that signature that like kind of like opened up this entire paradigm of like, hey, hold on a second. Like DMT has a ton of hyperbolic geometry. Like actually, once you know what to look for, is just all over the place, especially if you hit anywhere above magic eye. If you get to waiting room or above, it's like hyperbolic geometry is like super, super, super omnipresent. It's just that people are just not trained to be able to talk about it or like even notice it or pay attention.
So what is actually bending? Because I understand that this is like a super overly simplified question based on regular space perception, but we are postulating something representing the bending, even if it's some kind of a right. So what would that be?
Yeah. No, I have a deep answer to this. How do I put it? So how is space-time constructed, right? So physicists will actually say that space-time is emergent. Like it's not like there is this like fundamental like 3-dimensional space at the quantum level. Like actually at the quantum level, there's all of these interactions in the quantum vacuum. The quantum vacuum is actually super high dimensional, but then out of like the emergent interactions of those tiny components, you get like an emergent geometry arise. I'll give you, so this is an important kind of like concept, and which is the concept of the space time, the geometry can be emergent out of like low level interactions. So it's not like the network of quantum relationships is in a space and then like that's unfolding. It's more like no, the network of quantum interactions is the space, is the thing that is generating the space. And so this is very clear for example, like network science. So what you can do is that you can create a space out of a network. Like the most straightforward way of doing this is if you have a square lattice, and you connect every node to its adjacent nodes. You see what I mean? It's kind of just kind of like una cuadrícula, like a bunch of squares.
Yeah.
Okay, so like if you're in one node in that graph, and you start kind of like traversing the graph, and you see, okay, how many nodes will I arrive at as a function of how many steps I take, and you graph that, you will see that you can reach something like n square nodes, or times a constant. But yeah, essentially it's like it grows quadratically, right? Like
because it is a square.
Because it's kind of like in a two-dimensional space
where just because it's in complex plane. Okay, yeah.
Like 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 the area of a circle as a function of the radius grows like proportional to the radius squared, right?
Yeah.
Now imagine you are in that network, and then you do the same test, and you start seeing like, okay, how many nodes I can reach as a function of the number of steps, and you realize it's growing exponentially as opposed to growing quadratically. Okay. So that would mean that locally the space around you from your perspective is hyperbolic. Only in a hyperbolic space, well, that's not true. Like there's other conditions, but rather in a hyperbolic space, the number of nodes that you can reach grows exponentially as a function of your radius. And so you could actually start with that network, let's say, and here's the key conceptual idea, is that your sense of space is kind of like a live, breathing thing that is being manufactured, fabricated on the fly all the time. And so imagine in that lattice, usually each of those nodes, let's say, is a tiny sensation and is connected to other sensations next to it. Let's say that those sensations are coming and going. So it's like you see a node and it connects to its neighbors, and then like another node like disappears and decays. I mean, just as like sensations in your experience, they come and go. Right? Like we're made of all of these vibrations that are like kind of like interrelating to each other and creating a network as they interact with each other. If there's a proper balance of how the nodes appear and how they decay, let's say you can keep that you can modulate that with a parameter. You can kind of like keep at a homeostatic level where the lattice is flat, is Euclidean. But let's say now you change one of these parameters and you start to generate way more nodes than the nodes that decay. So then that network will start to become larger, right? Because the homeostatic level of like, okay, how large the network starts to build such that the number of nodes that disappear is the same as the nodes that come in, like it might require a bigger network. And on top of that, the shape of the network may change, right? It's like if you start having all of these nodes and you're connecting them to their environment, you have more and more and more and more and more connections. And then at some point, like if you start from any one of those nodes and you start traversing the graph, as opposed to that growing quadratically, it might start growing exponentially. So that would be kind of these like dynamically generated transition between an emergent spacetime that is Euclidean to an emergent spacetime that is hyperbolic. And I really think like it's a mechanism like this. It's because think about it, like the tracer effects on DMT, right? Like you move your hand around and you see like these copies kind of like lingering. All sensations on psychedelics last longer. So all sensations have more opportunity to connect to neighboring sensations. And as a consequence, the network of sensations becomes larger and thicker. And that is what it allows it to essentially start to change geometry and becomes like more dense And from the inside, it may look like, wow, space is expanding. But I think it's actually because there's an overflow of sensation, an overflow of connections between sensations that then emergently give rise to this expanded hyperbolic space. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. One thing that I'm trying to think about in terms of the question of the what is it that is bending, I take the point about the way that the space is constructed.
Yeah.
And everything you're saying tracks both my, well, at least more initial experiences with psychedelics, and then also, I mean, everything else that I'm aware of, in the literature about this. But, well, first of all, let's go one step at a time. First of all, if we're postulating some sort of bending, more energy equivalent to more ability to bend, does at any point it collapses upon itself? Like, is there a point where it just engulfs itself, so to speak? Is that
It can.
Okay.
Let me put it this way. Yeah. So classic example is like a thermal expansion. Like if you take an aluminum sheet, right? And you take a little bit of fire underneath, you will see the aluminum like starts to expand and it becomes crumbly, right? It becomes curved. I mean, the other example of like hyperbolic geometry that is very familiar to people is like a kale, because it's like you cannot flatten a kale, right? Like however you try to flatten it on the table, the curvature of the kale kind of like gets pushed elsewhere. So that would be an example of a.
It's an intrinsic property of its structure.
Yes.
And you're equivocating it to that. But okay, so we'll I'll yeah, go ahead.
Continue. Well, I mean, to answer your question, like what may happen? I mean, you can imagine like a very kind of like dynamically generated kale, which is like, hey, all of the parts of the leaves the cells are growing and expanding, and they're expanding the leaf. But also they have the capacity to reconnect or connect elsewhere. So what may happen is like the kale may be so expanded, it starts to actually kind of self-intersect. And so like all of a sudden, this part of the graph over here develops a connection to a part of the graph over here, as if there was a wormhole through it.
So literally a hyperlink, basically. Like it's okay.
And that is a change in topology, and that absolutely happens on DMT. I mean, I would argue, but it's a high dose phenomenon. I mean, that is typically breakthrough level DMT, where you start to have like topological changes.
And just to make it super clear for people, and you correct me if I got this wrong, but because we postulated that every node on the system is kind of like a point of experience, if 2 points that weren't close to each other in the topological space all of a sudden connect to each other, that's a very unique, almost like would you say that that's an emergent property experience? Like it's no longer one or the other, it's literally both of them at the same time kind of thing?
Yeah. I'll give you a concrete example to illustrate this, which is this didn't happen to me, but it's a trip report that somebody sent me, which is that on DMT they experienced kind of their body image of their forehead connecting to the body image of their toes, and so their body changed from being this stick figure to being this like cartwheel shape. So it's like, what is it like to be a wheel, right? What is it like to be like a donut? And like, well, it does feel like something. Is very strange, completely maladaptive, but like that qualia is accessible, and you need high dose DMT to experience it, but it's totally possible.
That's so interesting. So here's a fun one for you. I actually started thinking about how this might connect to some of the stuff that I'm investigating, and also actually in relationship to your work. I was in a festival once, and we didn't even know at the time, but it was literally we had no idea, but mistakenly we consumed 25i. And are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Like N-bombs? And
I haven't tried them, but I know what you're talking about. Yes.
Yeah. Holy smokes, man! First of all, it's like it's this and DMT, like they're kind of like the leaders in terms of visuals. There's nothing more than that. It's it literally DMT level visuals, super coherent, like right here in space. And we later discovered that we actually took like and by the way, this is like I highly don't recommend because apparently it actually has an overdose. You can actually become unalived versus LSD, which is not really a possibility.
Yeah.
We didn't know any of this, and we later discovered each one of us consumed like 5 doses, and of like a normal, like what would actually get you like fully out there. The interference pattern was so thick that I could not see my hand. Like if I would do this, I could not see my hand, but I could see into the earth through the sky. And we started noticing this kind of like what we imagined. The thing is that both me and him were locked in, and we both saw the same thing. We know because we were communicating, and we saw this, what we experienced to be this thing at the core of reality that does the trial and error. So kind of like this ultimate binary of try, works, bind. Try, doesn't work, continue, doesn't work, continue, try, doesn't work. So that thing, right?
Yeah.
And we started trying to express it to each other, and we just kind of like 2 Tasmanian devils just like yelling at each other like crazy. And there was one, I only remembered this a few days ago, and I was like, wait a second, this was not, we just kind of ignored it as a really cool party trick. But what we both experienced, we were at this, whatever, I don't know, it was like an EDC, so it was a lot of craziness, but somebody handed us these not polarizing, the glasses that do the whole, I think they're diffracted. It kind of does this like consolidated to the center thing, which is like there's a lot of iridescent lights, and then there's something in the middle that is just you looking through that, right? For both of us, I put him on first, and I go like, whoa. I was like, try this, and I give him the thing, and he's like, whoa. We both experienced exactly the same thing. In the middle, the world was completely normal. Completely normal, like a regular perception. So before it was just like, hey man, like cool party trick. But now that I'm thinking about it through the lens of your work and everything you're doing, and this like very deep analysis of like, okay, let's figure out what's actually going on. I betcha this would work for anyone. For some reason, I'm telling you, it was so clear that it was not like regular, not high, not nothing. And the interference pattern was so insane around. So it had something to do with light, coning of light, angle of light. This is actually, especially because I remembered this, that's why I really wanted to also kind of get with you into the liquid crystals, because I felt like something there that might actually be able to answer this.
Yeah.
And if it is true, by the way, I mean, that might be a really interesting thing to test what's actually going on, because now we can see what if we move the angle of whatever the glasses are doing. What does it do then? Does it actually make the world less normal, or is it just moving it around? Because then it would be like, what is it about the machinery of the brain that was still retaining the normal model, and what was being overlaid on top of it, and why was it canceled out at that exact point?
That is the first time I hear of that phenomenon. It's very intriguing, and I don't have any good ideas off the top of my head. I mean, I have a couple ideas, but this is fascinating.
Yeah. No, so if you ever, like, first of all, absolutely, I forgot about that completely. And first of all, I said I absolutely must tell you. Yeah, because if there's something there that might be super useful. But in the context of this, so the way that I think about everything, especially about really complex things, my kind of method, so to speak, is that I'm trying, because I don't have that much of the deeper technical capabilities, mathematical capabilities, all that stuff. I don't have a choice but to try and consolidate everything I hear to the best of my ability to something that is intuitively coherent. Yeah. And then I check. Usually I try to talk to an expert, and I check, hey, did I really understand? Am I tracking what's happening here? And very often they would correct me and say, no, not quite. And they would give me like, and then I kind of try and build a world model that way. So within that framework, so far, the way that everything I've absorbed from you, I'm thinking about this along those lines of the levels of emergence and what each level does in relationship to each and every one, and what do these connections look like, both in terms of the logic of its own topological space and in terms of what it actually feels like to be that, which to me it sounds, correct me if I'm wrong, you're thinking about this in somewhat similar kind of terms. And under that rubric, I have to admit that everything you're saying, and a lot of other experts in the psychedelic space, it makes sense to a point, and then my personal experience diverges from it.
Yeah.
And there's a few possibilities here. It diverges in the sense that it becomes coherent on a whole other level again, and so there's a few possibilities that I thought about, and I want to see what you think. Yeah. One is that if you really do it like beyond what you should ever do it, your brain eventually kind of gets like, okay, this is a lot. So instead of like working so hard to try and figure out what all this craziness is, I'm gonna actually like put a world model here. I'm just gonna guess whatever it is, and because there's no real, that's one possibility. Because if the situation is that it's all hallucination, so to speak, then because there's not actually anything that corrects it from the outside, the brain doesn't get punished for getting the answer wrong, so to speak, like kind of like the whatever the physical world does for the brain, right? Because whatever the brain is wrong, it gets that error signal. But in this case, if it is truly like all up for grabs and all just kind of like just super crazy hyperactivation of the brain, then the brain doesn't have this other thing to correct it. So it's like, you know what? I'm just going to go with whatever thing that made the most sense to me. I'm just going to make a thing out of it. So now every time I go to the space, it's like, it just makes that. It's like, and it's super coherent, but it's like, hey, I don't have nobody corrects me for it. So that's what it is now.
Yeah.
But the problem with that explanation for me is that why would it go for something so much more complex than so many other things that it could have come up with that is so much simpler? You know what I mean? Like, so that's what gives me the hint that maybe there's something here. Like it feels like, you know what it feels like more to me? It feels like really like kind of like with, what is it called? The Chladni plate or whatever. I never know how to pronounce these things. But like when you crank up the frequency, right? And then it's chaos and then restabilizes in a higher form of stability.
Yes.
It feels more like that.
Yeah.
So are you open to the proposition that maybe in addition to paying attention to the physics of the space or like the topology and everything else, there might actually still also be something in the signal itself that might be utilizing the infrastructure that you're investigating, but it is a real thing kind of external to us, so to speak. Maybe in simple terms, can aliens, you think, actually talk to us through whatever these signals are doing?
I mean, I'm very open to it, especially because of a number of reasons. I mean, one is like I know a lot of people who are very smart who swear that and some these things are real, but then also just personal experience. And like I was talking to you recently off camera, right? Like that is like okay, like I've had like over 1,000 experiences with 5-MeO DMT and over 1,000 with NN-DMT, and a lot of it, I am at the point where I can say like, okay, like we have like really good models that explains a big chunk of these, but there is a legitimate like very other big chunk that continues to like really make me wonder, and it's like for example that like more recently since last December that I went on a retreat. That I experienced like this, hyperdimensional Buddha mind type of unfolding that like it had been completely different than everything else that I had experienced before, and also like shows a sign of like independent intelligence on another level.
You're right. The connection between what we can say about this also in third person is the only way to verify with each other, because we're the nodes on the system that are comparing notes. And if we can't compare notes, then there's nothing can be said. But at the same time, if we are playing that game, then we shouldn't discard so quickly the importance of even what seems to be an anomalous experience, but somebody who did spend enough time to actually investigating these things seriously and to not be fooled by those. It doesn't mean that that you can't be fooled by those, but it's a lot less likely. It's like there's this really famous parkour guy, his name is Don Tomate. He's like this Australian crazy at this point man. But he truly is just like one of the craziest people to do the craziest things, And he always says, fear not of the person who did 1,000 flips. Fear of the person who did the same flip 1,000 times. Because he does this one flip where he just goes from really high and he just front flips and just rolls out of it from like buildings, and just insane. So I do feel that this needs to be taken into account. To me, it seems like that is a form of communication. The agreement part, the like, oh yeah, we're saying the same thing part. It's like so, and ultimately we would have to like show something that would be translatable to this space. And I do want you to say at least a couple of words about, and feel free to say more about the particular ways in which you guys are now the kind of the cutting edge of what you're doing now in Qualia Research Institute with that? Like how
Yeah.
do you took it from the inner, just like comparing a bunch of nodes, taking a bunch of nodes?
Yeah.
You guys are now mapping it into something tangible.
Yeah.
Can you say something about that?
Oh, absolutely. It's um, the first thing I'll mention is the color thing. For example, the way in which we want to actually bring this to essentially mainstream science and show like something like this is actually happening and it's possible is to actually recruit these states of consciousness for meaningful computation. The leading edge in this is actually from my collaborator Cube Flipper. I recommend an article called "Hyper Computation Without Bothering the Cactus Person." It's kind of a high context title, so I'm not going to explain fully like the meaning of it. But essentially, my collaborator Cube Flipper, they created this interface, visual interface that actually has like this very difficult, what's called a constraint satisfaction problem in the visual domain, where tiles, it's called tile space. The tiles in the system are supposed to be oriented either like as if they were concave or as if they were like convex. And it turns out that like solving that, finding out whether something should be concave or convex, so that everything is consistent, is a mathematically very difficult problem. And what we want to test is if we actually can do it better while on DMT, having the strong guess that like, hey, DMT might actually allows us to really tap into like a very fast search process. And that is the sort of thing that like, okay, like we can actually run a test and collect a bunch of data. We're like, okay, you try it 30 times as sober, and then you try it 30 times on DMT, or you flip, so that is not the order of the thing that matters. And then imagine on DMT, people perform like 3 standard deviations better than like how they perform normally. Like that.
This is already real data?
No.
Oh, okay. Imagine. Okay.
No, exactly. Imagine. There are some things where we have seen performance enhancements. This still, this would be a breakthrough. Like this is like would be a huge deal. But it's like the sort of thing that we intend to really do. I mean, effectively, using the brain as a kind of supercomputer in a way that neuroscientists would say like that should not be possible, and then like actually demonstrating it. One thing that we do have is we actually have like some tasks where we are fairly confident based on like n of like approximately 20, and 20 people, it works for 20 people. But we haven't tested it with the general population. But it is essentially, there are some images, for example, where in our retreats, part of the methodology of our retreat was, we would do explorations, and then we would together look at experiments or images, visualizations that we created in advance, that we thought, based on theory, that there should be something interesting when you look at it on a specific psychedelics. And then we would be able to comment in real time. What does it look like? We would record those conversations, transcribe them. And then, as soon as we are capable of, we come down enough to be able to write code and drawings, then, we write a couple like shaders, a couple like simulations in HTML and JavaScript. And then, within an hour, we have kind of like some level of consensus in the group of like just how something actually kind of looked like. And one of the things that we discovered through that methodology is there are some images that they are moving. Like objectively, the image is moving. It's just moving very slowly and in a very peculiar way that is not very intuitive. And what happens is if you look at those animations sober, and I ask you, is this an animation or is this a picture? 95% of people say it's just a picture. Like there's nothing moving there. Now, if you're on mushrooms and you look at that, you will say, yes, it is moving. But it's not that you're hallucinating the movement. You're actually perceiving the movement more accurately for very deep reasons that have to do with cross-frequency coupling and things related to fractals, because the movement is actually very fractal. So it's like something that like being in the psilocybin type of mindset actually allows you to like perceive and interlock with and like really embody. And indeed, like if the image is not moving, at those dosages, you on psilocybin, you will say like, yeah, this is not moving. In other words, we are fairly confident that within a window of like low dose psilocybin, this actually is like genuine performance enhancement. You're actually able to perceive the world better in some ways.
Yeah, you controlled for it. It always felt, specifically mushrooms always felt like a heightened frame rate and a heightened resolution. Like especially
Yeah.
when you look at a flickering fire, for example, it's very clear because it literally starts looking like an OLED, like super HD TVs. It's just
Yeah.
like you can see this. Is that what? Obviously, in the brain works very differently than in the camera, but for all intents and purposes, how much of a heuristic is what I just said, and how much of it is like kind of close to what is actually happening to your perception? Would you say?
I would say like what you're describing is like a solid like 20% of it or something like that. Like the enhanced resolution and frame rate is a very important component of the experience. But in particular, what enables people to see the movement of this image is, we believe, with argument, is something what we call like a enhanced cross frequency coupling. Like the classic example of this is, I mean, I'm sure you've been, let's say, on mushrooms and looking at a tree, or especially something like a pine tree, and you actually see it much more fractal in that, like you actually see like all the leaves are kind of like connected to the entire tree, and you see the tree repeated like in all of the branches as if it was an actual mathematical fractal. Um, Oftentimes, actually, that's a little bit of an incorrect perception. Like sometimes you may actually be hallucinating more fractalness than there's actually there. Where like once you come down and you realize, oh, actually that branch didn't actually look that symmetrical to that other branch. Like that symmetry is something you were hallucinating. But what is really happening there, I would argue, is that the gestalts of different spatial frequencies, different sizes, are able to interlock and resonate with gestalts of other sizes. In other words, like a small cube and a large cube on a psilocybin trip, they can feel like they're part of the same object. They're kind of connected. Whereas in normal perception, we first of all separate scales. So like we detect the fine detail kind of like separately from the coarse outline, and then we put those together. Whereas on psilocybin, we kind of like process all of it as just one big thing, and we connect things across a scale. And so the movement in those images is very fractal like that. It's like the movement is very subtle, but it's repeating in the same way across different scales. And so when you perceive it on psilocybin, you perceive that movement as an integrated, unified object, or like unified phenomenon, because it's the same movement across all scales.
Is that how
Yeah.
it was simulated, like on purpose?
Is that what?
This cross scale element, is that how it was simulated on purpose to see if it actually matches that on mushrooms?
Actually, no. Like actually, this was like a corner case of a simulation where it just happened to be doing that,
Oh,
and
cool.
then but
Happy accident.
yeah, exactly, happy accident. And it was like one of the strongest effects, one of the strongest, like, hey, like this looks so different on psilocybin than normal. And then it was a puzzle. It's like, why? And then that led us to cross frequency coupling. I mean, this is another reason why, like, let's say, like, it's another pitch for this type of like research, because if it had been in academia, you would actually have had to test specifically a hypothesis to begin with, and like write your grant application with that in mind. And so like you would have actually done maybe precisely something like, oh, we're going to test like the frame rate of psilocybin, but like, hey, maybe actually the thing that was different was the cross frequency coupling. If you don't have kind of this like think tank approach where like you serendipitously find interesting things and then you try to work out, okay, but why? What is the mathematics behind this that is making this happen? And also it allows us to do really quick iterations, because like as soon as we found that image, we had the code for how to generate it, and people in the team are just very technical talent. So like within a couple hours, we had like generated dozens of like versions of it that could allow us to test different variants of the hypothesis. And and then on the next psilocybin trip, we looked at those. It's a very, very fast iteration process essentially with this method.
And that's really the secret to actual progress, because people kind of forget. And interesting. And this is something that would you say a couple of words about what you guys are about to be presenting also in San Francisco? Yeah,
exactly. So November 20th, 2025, I guess if you're tuning in from another year. I mean, it's kind of like a big reveal of everything we have found in the last 2 years approximately. since the psychedelic retreats, roughly, like, the big reveal for QRI 3.0 before we go to QRI 4.0, which is going to be the next chapter in a sense. And one of the things that we're presenting is this amazing. I would say it's amazing. Well, of course I would say that, but it's like this amazing replication tool. You have seen it, right? Like you've seen on my computer
Yep.
How to create all of these crazy trippy visuals, and all of that is like the result of all of these years of research, that arriving at the math behind that, and then getting together with awesome programmers for a couple of weeks in Tepoztlan, and hunkering down and writing it and testing it. And but it's not only that, this is not an artistic project. It really is like a scientific project. So it's not like, hey, we're only able to make trippy visuals. Actually what's behind this effort is that then we show those visuals to people who are very experienced with different psychedelics, and not only us, not just the team, but like, in general in the internet. And what we do is we ask participants to look at each of the images, animations, and rate them by how similar they are to, for example, DMT or 5-MeO DMT or LSD and so on. And then you can run a regression analysis that uses, the underlying parameters that generate the image, the dynamic system that generate the image. And with machine learning or statistics, you essentially try to predict which underlying parameters determine whether something is going to look like mushrooms versus something is going to look like 5-MeO DMT. And it is based on that research that we essentially have arrived at some like very solid quantitative predictions of like, hey, what actually psilocybin and 5-MeO DMT are doing at the level of coupled oscillators in the organism. And some of this is like somewhat easy to explain. Some of this, it's like I might need a couple of lectures to really get into it. But the basic idea is something along the lines of DMT does is it generates this dynamic self-organizing principle we call competing clusters of coherence. So it's like kind of like different chunks of your world simulations. Locally, they're coherent, right? Like on DMT, you may see like, oh, there's a patch of symmetries over here, and there's another patch of symmetries here. And maybe they're different. Maybe they're incompatible. Like maybe this is like hexagonal symmetry, this is like square symmetry. And they're kind of like fighting each other because they don't fit together very well. And a lot of what DMT is about is the dialogue between these incompatible symmetries, trying to reconcile each other and harmonize the system. Whereas 5-MeO DMT is a completely different self-organizing principle, which is everybody, all of the oscillators in your world simulation are trying to synchronize with all of the other ones. So like rather than only synchronizing locally, sort of like everybody is kind of like receiving a signal of like, okay, how is the whole organism vibrating, and can I synchronize to that? It's almost kind of like the like the wave in football, right? Like in a football stadium, is like you're not paying attention to just like one person, right? Like you're looking at the entire wave and you're trying to coordinate around the wave. Like 5-MeO is like that. Like there's like a wave in the entire body, and it's almost like all of the cells, all of the vibrations are trying to like, how do I tune to that wave? Whereas on DMT, it's very much like, oh, every part is like its own part of its own kingdom, and they're kind of like fighting each other, and like there's alliances, there's complex politics between these patterns and stuff. But at the end of the day, it is very difficult to create a DMT experience where you actually experience, let's say, like unity consciousness without checkerboard patterns, like still kind of like around. Mm-hmm. And checkerboard patterns is kind of very quintessentially these competing clusters of coherence. It's just sort of like everybody is like oscillating between a qualia and its opposite, like, green, magenta checkerboard patterns, or, blue, yellow checkerboard patterns. And, they intermesh and they're competing and so on. So it's a very different type of algorithm or self-organizing system. And what's really cool is like, with our research paradigms, we can quantitatively demonstrate this and make predictions, even to the point of being able to predict what the combination of different drugs may actually feel like. Because it's not just like, hey, like we're measuring receptor occupancy. It's more like, well, if you combine this type of, this type of self-organizing principle and this type of self-organizing, what happens when you put them at once? And oftentimes you may get like a chimera state, for example. Like if you take salvia and DMT together, they don't blend well. it's more actually like you have like patches of salvia and patches of DMT, and they compete with each other. And that is like the sort of thing that we can predict. Is like, hey, if you combine these two self-organizing principles, you will have patches where it behaves in one way and patches where it behaves in a different way. And I guess, yeah, the last kind of like quick thing to mention about this is that we are moving towards, I mean, one of the key things we're fundraising for is another legal psychedelic retreat, again, with top technical people. And also, there's still like open spots for if we find like additional talent and people who, if people are listening here and, you feel like you fit in the demographic and you're very experienced, reach out, you might be a candidate. Effectively, we're moving towards not only replicating the vibrational texture and symmetries and all of these things I've been talking about, but specifically actually the more non-trivial physics involved, and in particular non-linear optics is our current focus. That there are, I mean, my claim is that the brain is not a classical computer; it's actually a non-linear optical computer, and maybe here is where I need to introduce one more framework before we go to the liquid crystals. But yes, any questions? Yeah,
absolutely. Just a tiny question about what the technology you're going to be presenting and what I saw on your computer. Would you then be able to also do the opposite, so kind of like a Fourier transform of the combinations, and tell me which substances were involved, basically?
Yeah. I mean, that's actually one of the results. So, and I've got to be honest, like, what we have achieved. Okay, let me put it this way.
You don't know if you want to say it because you're
no, it's not that. I'm struggling how to articulate it so that it doesn't, so like I can express that this is actually very significant, even though the numbers don't seem that much. So let me put it this way. Okay, so what we can do is, imagine you took a drug yesterday. You don't know what drug it is. You only know that it's like one out of like 7. Like there's like this bag of 7 stuff. It could be like DMT, it could be 5-MeO, it could be 2CB, LSD, psilocybin, ketamine, or MDMA. Like that is the bag. Now, what we can do is we show you, let's say, like 20 animations, and then you rate them by how similar they look to what you experienced yesterday. So based on those ratings, with our system, we can guess what drug you took yesterday. Now, the accuracy of our system is about like 45%. But, you have to understand that this is like 45% relative to a baseline of like 14%. Why 14? Because if you're selecting out of 7 substances, chance level is 14%, right? So it's not a super accurate system, but it's like way better than chance. And
so you're already showing there's a departure away from chance.
Exactly. Very big departure. But I do want to get the system to be sufficiently accurate so that, for example, we can get like 80% accuracy. And I think that's just a matter of continuing to iterate, just continuing the paradigm.
And so, okay, good. Now, please introduce what you wanted to introduce.
Yes. Do you know cell animation? Does this ring a bell? What cell animation is?
It actually sounds familiar, but let me just... Animation. The second I say an image, I can... Actually, not what the first thing that comes up on Google. No.
Okay. So cell animation is where... I'm just thinking like if this is even helpful. Maybe not. But cell animation is like... Well, here's like some logos. It's like... In old cartoons, I guess like before making cartoons digitally became like the norm. Mm-hmm. I guess kids don't know this. Like I didn't know as a kid that like cartoons like were actually like recorded with like a camera that is taking a picture on a series of images that are made of transparent cell like I guess like cell. I forget but essentially these like transparent sheets.
Okay.
Where it's all transparent except for one tiny detail. So, for example, the background in a cartoon may stay the same, but then the character is moving its mouth, right? And like nothing else changes, and it's just the mouth is changing. How that is accomplished is like, well, the background is remaining the same, but they have like different plastic sheets with just the mouth. And the mouth is like, in some of those are like this, in some are like this, and they're changing that between frame and frame. So that is called cell animation, because you can construct the scene using different cell layers. Like, it's a very modular approach of how to construct a scene, and
It's
it
more like
saves
Photoshop, basically.
yeah, like layers of Photoshop, exactly. And it saves you a ton of money in animators, right? The background, you don't
Wait
need to
a
draw
month,
the
yeah.
background again. Or like, this very annoying thing where like, Tom and Jerry or whatever, and like they're like running in the house, and you see the background is just being repeated again and again. And it's like, how large is that house? It's like, yes, there's all of those tricks to save on animation costs. Essentially what I'm proposing is that the brain is doing something actually remarkably similar to this. So this may resonate or not, that like on DMT, sometimes something that happens is like an object like appears and then disappears. Oh, it has the feeling of you're crossing through a higher dimension or something, and just like something just briefly intersects. Well, what I'm going to suggest, and of course this is on the secular, like prosaic side, is like, oh, it's all mind generated, but yeah, that's what I'm exploring at this moment. Is what's happening is the way your world simulation is constructed is like through these layers, and different brain modules are in charge of like adding different types of layers. So you have a brain module that is like specialized in faces, and so like whenever in the screen there is like eyes and nose and mouth, it takes all of those cell animation elements, it edits them and wraps them inside a face, and then it projects the face back onto the scene. And so the experience that you're having is this like living, breathing document of a lot of different modules looking at the same thing and editing it in a way that corresponds to their specialized knowledge for how to do it. And more so, this actually can be done like potentially like electromagnetically. So you may remember from like these like old digital clocks, for example, that like the number is actually constructed out of these like 8 different or like 7 different lines. You can draw a 7, you can draw a 5, and so on. Well, the way in which you do that is they're passing a current through this tiny cell animation element, which is usually transparent. And by passing a current, that turns from transparent to opaque. So what I'm going to suggest is that, hey, your subconscious has a lot of these like kind of like latent, transparent cell animations, and the brain is able to kind of like find them as a prototype and put it in the screen, and then pass a current through it and make it opaque and make it visible. And so often, like I think like that happens a lot on DMT. For example, like if you're in a bad mood, I would literally argue that there's kind of like spiky, unpleasant cell animation elements that are transparent usually. And if something is transparent, it still is going to affect your mind, even if you're not able to see it. But then on DMT, is like all of a sudden you're able to pass a current and they become visible. And so it's kind of you're materializing. Yeah.
So what's your take on, I don't want to take us too far afield, but I feel like it's a very important question to ask you. What is your take on Andrew Gallimore's point that, which I am actually basing a lot on, it makes a lot of sense to me, both experientially and also logically, that, well, I already kind of made that point like in a little bit of a different way, but essentially the fact that when you're talking about simulating faces, whatever it is that is happening, that makes perfect sense in so many ways. But why the brain doesn't produce content, right? So like, does it come from? Like, aside from the hyperbolic spaces, when we do experience these like highly coherent, very advanced, make sense on their own right, so they have their own rules of operation that are way more advanced than ours. Like to your mind, where does that come from? If you have to kind of try and like fold it into a more scientific framework, did you ever think about that?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to cover there. I mean, I remember Andrew Gallimore talking to Joe Rogan, which happened quite recently. He talks about like the difference between dream phenomenology and DMT phenomenology, which I think is like really spot on. Like he mentions people like to conflate or equate these two, and it's like,
I
no.
never knew what they're talking about. I'm like, what? Not even a little bit the same. I'm like, what are you talking about?
Like, it's true that DMT has a little bit of like this like dreamy, maybe like oniric vibe, a little
Only in
bit.
the dissipating between your fingers when you're out of it part,
Sure.
but not in the phenomenology. Like,
No,
not
no,
at
no.
all. That being said, I am open to the possibility that some people are experiencing dreams differently. See, this is because some people talk
True.
about like astral projection, and sometimes it's just like
Yeah.
somebody's wacky imagination. But I've met serious people who are saying no, like, and they say to me like, no, it feels very much like super realistic. And now I've never experienced it, so I can't say. But maybe to some people it does feel that way. I don't know.
Yeah. And yeah, people experience dreams in black and white, and other people experience it in color. And
But my perception, I'm with Andrew and with you. Like, I don't. There seems to be oil and water. They're completely different phenomenologies.
Yeah, because actually, exactly. Like, so here's the difference. One key difference is like normal everyday life is this balance between high order conceptual reifications. Is like, okay, the concept of a cube, the concept of a person, and low level sensory detail that fill in the gaps. In dreams, what dominates is the high level concepts and the high level archetypes or prototypes, but the sensory detail is just not stable. And so that's why, like, when you look at your clock or the phone on a dream, it looks discombobulated, and you try to read the letters, and like they go away, because really you're interacting with your conception of a phone as opposed to like any kind of stable sensory input about a phone. I think DMT is actually kind of even more extreme in the other direction, which is you're getting so much sensory detail that it actually sometimes like overwhelms your conceptual frameworks. And it's like, okay, there's no conception, there's no percept archetype or prototype that I can use to capture all of this sensory information, which kind of like breaks the system. I mean, in the QRI model, this is essentially like an energetic equilibrium. Like the sensory input is a kind of energy, like it's energizing the system, whereas your interpretation of the sensory input is an energy sink. It's kind of like capturing that energy. And so the brain is trying to minimize energy, is trying to kind of like get rid of the excess energy from the senses. And usually the equilibrium of like, okay, the energy coming in, the energy getting dissipated is the normal everyday awake experience. On DMT, the balance changes, and you're getting way more sensory input than you're capable of reifying and turning into objects. That said, I do think that, kind of like the physics of this process can account for a big chunk of DMT phenomenology, which is that, effectively, you are raising the energy parameter. I mean, kind of what you were saying, like you take the Cialdini plate and you increase the frequency, and it first becomes chaotic, but then it becomes like, again, like locked in other resonant modes that are higher frequency. I mean, that's like super, super typical of DMT experiences. You're just kind of going through the frequency range. Frequency, as in physics, is one way in which energy expresses. I mean, like all else being equal, higher frequency means higher energy. I say all else being equal because you also need to take into account, for example, the intensity. It's like you could have a very high frequency but very dull experience versus a very low frequency, very energized, very intense. And so it's like all else being equal, frequency is higher energy, but it's not always. You've got to take into account some other things. Other things that also include energy is how fast things are moving, kind of like the speed of transformation, the brightness of sensations. Another one is like the sense of tension and compression. That is also another way energy manifests. And I actually, energy here, honestly, I don't think it's going to be like a metaphor. Like ultimately, I think it's going to be quite like literally, because energy in physics, it has like a number of properties that are like well defined. People get annoyed at like hippies is saying like, oh, I feel the energy on meditation, and say like, oh, that's just a very vague connection. Here, actually, I would argue like, no, the connection is very strong, because energy really refers to essentially like invariance. Like, what is something that remains the same as you transform a system, right? Like with a pendulum, the potential and the kinetic energy add up to the same number, right? Like, and that's called the Lagrangian of the system. It's like, okay, like how do you add up the different features so that you get a number that stays the same if the system is closed? On DMT, you may have like a really bright image that is a type of energy that then turns into something moving very fast. And I find that like, well, for a given level of the DMT experience, the intensity of the experience or the energy of the experience keeps transforming from one type to another. So my understanding here is that, well, DMT fundamentally is something like it's boosting the power of the signal of some of the lower levels of the predictive coding hierarchy, not necessarily the lowest layer. I mean, and maybe that is one of the interesting things. I don't think it's necessarily boosting the retina. Like, I don't think it's like boosting like at that level, because that would actually just feel just like turning on the lights brighter. Like it wouldn't feel trippy. I think what's kind of boosting is like some of the early layers of processing that are interfacing with the sensory input, but also already have their own ideas of what the sensory inputs is supposed to be. So like the thing that is getting boosted is like a slightly processed sensory input, or kind of like a partially digested sensory input before like the high level of processing. But then it's overwhelming the system with that energy, and the high level conceptual system is not able to capture all of that energy and get rid of it to establish like the normal baseline. And so you end up adjusting to essentially a higher homeostatic level of energy, and full of detail. But my interpretation here, or the secular, prosaic interpretation, is it is full of detail because the thing that you're boosting is some of the lower levels of the predictive coding hierarchy.
What if they represent something completely orthogonal than what you're familiar with? In other words, the building blocks don't resemble anything you've ever seen before.
Yeah. So here's what happens. So in this model, I mean, you have like the predictive coding hierarchy, and let's say DMT, I would argue, is kind of like is boosting maybe this layer. It's not the lowest layer, not the top layer. It's just kind of this kind of like strata closer to the. So what happens is that when you really
so it's not. So just to clarify to people, so it's not the layers that kind of code for, lines, but like it's already some structure, but not highest level, like the somewhere in the middle is what you mean.
Yeah, like checkerboard patterns.
Okay.
Regular geometric shapes, for example, like squares, pentagons, triangles, very basic archetypical movements, for example, like turning 90 degrees, for example. There's like a basic primitive of like some operation that like DMT typically applies to objects. I mean, it's like, right, like you get to like a certain dose of DMT, and it's not only you experience flickering gestalts, but they're also like geometrically transforming and getting reprojected. I think there's like a super basic low-level sensory processing transformation. It's super necessary for survival, because, I mean, if you think of like an animal in the forest, they have to be able to like turn their head around and somehow transform what they were experiencing before into what they experience next, which is like, oh, there's like something in the brain that allows you to kind of like take what you were experiencing and it very quickly reproject it as if you were looking at it from a different angle. So
you think it's being swapped in the saccade, or do you think it's the blur of the motion of your eyes are open is still the world predicting the next step, is it not?
Yeah.
It sounded like what you described is almost like a swap, like a placard swap of some sort, and I guess can happen if you.
Yeah. Actually, the phenomenology of saccade movements is an excellent, like the micro adjustments of shapes on DMT very much feel reminiscent to kind of like mini saccade effects. Yes.
Which, by the way, the slightly more extravagant interpretation I'm giving the whole situation is that I'm saying that the buffering happens between your saccades. That's why it's designed that way, so they can literally buffer the frames in between. So there's never a mistake. It's like.
Anyways. Within the simulation, a simulation is
paradigm? So like if they're basically that's the idea. The reason it happens is because the saccades allow them to literally reframe the thing. Yeah.
You're making me paranoid, dude. I'm joking. They're hiding between the saccades.
But continue, please. So I do want to understand this because from what you described to me just now, those seem to be mutually exclusive statements. One is which there's a swap. And in the other one, there's still tracking, brain guessing the next moment. Well, but it sounds like you're saying, no, there's a reconciling thing that can...
But I mean, here's the thing is like, okay, which layers of the hierarchy are able to cohere and synchronize. Like that is the key thing. So I would argue, I mean, like let's say like LSD. So like LSD is actually kind of like lower frequency. Like the patterns are like more broad, and the flickering rate is like lower than DMT. DMT is very fast. And so the things that resonate with the flickering patterns of LSD are actually more kind of intermediate and the high levels of the hierarchy. And so sometimes you can get this like very beautifully coherent kind of like, okay, you see a shape or a cube, and everything kind of like tessellates away from it, and it's this like beautiful fractal coherence. DMT though, like typically is like the checkerboard patterns, the things that crystallize is more kind of competing clusters of coherence in this layer, I would argue. And so this layer is like very quickly oscillating and interacting with its adjacent layers. So you may get something like, okay, like a grid pattern with cubes and spikes on top of it. It's like, okay, that's like the next layer. It's like you're kind of like decorating just the base checkerboard pattern with a few more features. And imagine if, you know, the communication between those two layers is super fast on DMT, whereas the communication between those two layers and your high level cognition is slow. And so because those are updating so fast, they acquire a life of their own, and they start evolving as if they had their own agency, as if they had their own life. And so I interpreted this almost kind of this like, not to sound too terrible, but it's almost kind of this like cancerous, like, intermediate levels of the hierarchy representations that acquire a life of their own because of the really enhanced communication and resonance that does not include the rest of the organism. And so they can actually, you know, they can colonize you, they can feel like their own thing.
And why are they interacting faster with each other? They're closer in the cortical columns? Or like what makes their communication faster with each other versus the higher levels?
Oh, I think it's because of the particular receptor affinity of DMT that likely specifically, I mean, with 5-HT2A, like one of the things that 5-HT2A does is, I mean, this is still somewhat you know, this is like science that is forming, but like okay. the thing for, especially for anybody who's like a neuroscientist or like studying a PhD, like I highly recommend you look into the work of Marco Aquil. The key term is called divisive normalization. And so, I mean, this really is like cutting edge neuroscience, and it's still under development, but honestly, I think like this is where a lot of like breakthrough understanding is going to happen. And a lot of what they're finding in academia is kind of mirroring what we found out independently in our research, with some differences and some contradictions, but like the overall kind of direction is the same. And so essentially what they are doing is like they analyze the microcircuitry of different layers of the cortex. They look at like different receptor types, for example, 5-HT1A, 5-HT2A, GABA, and dopamine. And then they, based on that, they can predict, they can model how the activation of a certain cortical column either activates or inhibits other cortical columns that are at different distances away from it. So what happens is that with DMT, or like with 5-HT2A in particular, so there's this phenomenon called lateral inhibition. This is really fundamental for like processing in the brain, which is that if you have like a cortical column that detects, let's say, like edges in this direction, when that gets activated, it's going to inhibit the surrounding cortical columns, because the surrounding cortical columns represent, for example, lines in other directions that are incompatible, right? So when your brain detects, oh, there's a line in this direction, it's not only boosting that, it's also inhibiting the other directions it could have had. What seems to be happening on DMT within this paradigm is that inhibition is subdued to a certain extent. And so the image that gets propagated to the next layer is not just a clean, hey, it's just this one possible orientation. It ends up being kind of this like multitude of possible orientations. And so the next layer is kind of like has more material to work with. And then it's going to try to fit all that information and create a model of the world where like somehow there's like a bunch of lines that are overlapping in a space that they shouldn't fit. And I think like that is also one of the reasons where like, okay, like further down the hierarchy, it ends up having to construct these really elaborate models to account for like those strange superposition of different patterns that they should not be put together, or like in principle they couldn't be put together. And it is
So
precisely
wouldn't that also explain? Please don't forget what you were about to say, but I know
yeah.
I will. Wouldn't that explain your experience in that big castle with the orientation that was not supposed to be possible?
We think that's a key piece of the puzzle, absolutely. That
Okay, continue. Sorry. Yeah.
yeah. So effectively, with something like divisive normalization, I mean the QRI version of this is what we call the coupling kernel, which essentially is how different oscillators want to be in the same phase or different phase to oscillators at different distances from it. And we think like the signature of a drug or the signature of a state of consciousness has a lot to do with like the particular shape of that wave, of like how you want to be similar or different to things of different distances. And DMT in our paradigm, across the entire system, the way we understand it is like it's actually like all the oscillators are trying to be in opposite phase to their neighbors. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky, right? Because what I just said with divisive normalization is the opposite. For like that, actually, they want to be they're less competitive with their neighbors. But that's a really, really localized thing. Whereas like we think like if you zoom out a little bit, and based on simulations that we've done, at a higher scale, when you take into account the interaction between the layer and its neighbors, then you start actually seeing this emergent pattern where like patterns are trying to be opposite to their neighbors. But that's like a bigger kind of like macroscopic effect.
So basically, the effect moves from like a smaller region to a larger region. Really, like the thing that is now competing with each other are larger chunks versus like a smaller thing. I understand. Okay, so there's I want to be respectful of your time and your energy. There's one thing that I really want to touch on, and there's other things. There's also maybe a couple of questions I wanted to ask from the audience. So I'm going to try and put all of this in a very short period of time.
Yes.
Because one of the things that people really wanted, first of all, you brought up also, you sent me an article to read about, this whole perception that can AI be conscious and all that stuff. And it's a fascinating topic.
Yes.
It's a fascinating topic. So maybe here's what we're going to do. I'm just going to ask the kind of the last part that I really wanted to ask you. And then if we feel like there's enough energy, we'll say a couple of words about it. We can always do another one later, so we don't like run ourselves into the ground in terms of energy. So the thing that I do want to touch on, the last thing from my side of the questions, I never hear a satisfactory answer to this. And I think obviously for a good reason, because I don't think anybody really knows. But it sounds to me like people almost insist on choosing one side of the ledger to play, and they refuse to accept the other side of it. So it's almost like physicists, you know exactly where I'm going with this, right? Like physicists would just like, hey man, it's all an emergent property. Your consciousness is just not, as Sean Carroll recently, somebody complained about him saying in the podcast, I don't want to talk about something that isn't real. I'm like, well, say what? But on the other side, it seems to be this just as egregious of a mistake from the people who kind of investigate more the internal space. I mean, scientifically, I don't mean just like contemplative way. There's this almost like refusal to grapple with what is this? Like, what is physical? Like, what? Like, even you can talk about all day long about the content the brain creates, but like, dude, you can't walk through the wall though. Yeah. And also, you keep talking, not you, but like anybody who's making these noises. Everybody keeps saying in neuroscience what the brain, the signals it receives from the outside. And I was like, okay, but what's the outside? What is that then? Right? Yeah. So like, especially if we're kind of talking about more of a idealistic perspective, well, to me, like, yeah, there's a way to reconcile this. You can say that however the mind at large arranges itself and represents itself to itself would look like the laws of physics. That's, to me, it sounds completely like it makes perfect sense. But then should we not also talk more specifically about what that is? One of the things that Bernardo Kastrup is in the habit of doing, which I agree basically with like 99% of everything he's saying, but there's this one component where I would love to ask him one day, but like I'm confused by that, and I want to use this as a spark for this last final question that I have for you. He is very good at describing almost the entire chain of causation from the perspective of like philosophically coherent vision that comes from the idea that consciousness is all there is. Yeah. But there's constantly this it's almost like he slides off it. Like the question of why then that versus no other arrangement of the conscious. So like if you want to say that this is some larger consciousness operation that gives rise to these inner smaller bubbles of consciousness that is us, why does it present exactly this content versus any other content? It seems to be like a really crucial question. What is it about the operation of the mind at large that translates to this? Did you ever venture into this kind of level of what is it about the specifics of how this? Either you think of it as a mind, either you think of it as a higher informational space. However, it is that you think about whatever is quote unquote outside of us. Yeah. Did you ever think about what are the specifics about its operation that translate maps to this specifically and not something else?
Totally. Yeah. Maybe a quick comment on some other things that you mentioned is, like Bernardo Kastrup. I mean, huge respect, intellectual respect, and I think what he does is great. I would have the same point, which is that maybe a little bit of kind of like not venturing into like making guesses where he could be wrong about it. Like, well, I would just encourage him to like dare to be like totally wrong about something just by exposing. He's kind of doing that with the aliens. Yeah. He's a hypothesis there, but yeah, for example, like he talks about like, okay, like we're all one. There's we're all kind of like different alters of like universal consciousness. Something that like I broadly agree with some caveats. And then he talks about like, okay, there's like some dissociation process that allows the universal mind to become individuals. But then the thing that I don't see kind of like really discussed is like, okay, but what is the mechanism of action for this dissociation? And then like, how is evolution interfacing with that mechanism of action? One of the things that we are effectively trying to propose, and again, we could be totally wrong, is that dissociation is actually topological segmentation. Like it is like when you take a balloon and you twist it from both ends and you get a pinch point in the center. Like that happens in the fields of physics all the time. Like electromagnetism, you get these plasma tubes trapped in topological confinement in the sun. And if the mechanism of dissociation is something like that, all of a sudden you have like a huge amount of detail that fills in and explains a lot of philosophical puzzles, because if the mechanism of like the individuation is topological segmentation, then evolution would have a reason to use it. Like evolution would actually want to create these individual pockets, because by creating a pocket, by making a topological segmentation, you're effectively allowing everything within the pocket to interact with itself, and you're preventing it from interacting with its environment. And so this is a physical mechanism at the level of equations that allow for a causally meaningful dissociation, right? Like you don't want a kind of dissociation that is just a line drawn in the sand, right? Like you want a dissociation that actually does something. Like it's causally significant.
Exactly.
And for me, it's extending, I guess, like Bernardo Kastrup's kind of like reasoning to like, okay, yeah, let's enrich it with like, okay, like causal efficacy and qualia, and where does the qualia come from, and how do you interface it with, for example, process philosophy? I would say that, yeah, like, process philosophy actually, I think, has a key piece of the puzzle, which is that the content of an experience results from combining previous experiences and referring to them. In other words, like, this actually becomes like much more obvious in like deep meditation, that like the content of an experience at a very deep level is the previous experience. Like you're actually commenting on the experience that you just had. Plus information from the sensory stream. So it's kind of, you have the sensory stream, and then you have like the previous experience. The next experience is the combination of those two. It's like you're taking the previous experience, new sensory input, and you're commenting on the previous experience. And at the level of like the fundamental nature of reality, that is a key piece of the puzzle. I think like that if the universe is kind of this foam of lots of different tiny experiences where each bubble is a different moment of experience, you could imagine that, okay, like a very large bubble in that foam would be like you, and another large bubble is me. What separates you and me is not like space in this like, empty space as an abstract thing, or empty space as a inert thing. No, it's quantum foam. It's like a lot of tiny micro experiences. And those tiny micro experiences can actually unite with ours. I mean, like when you have like foam, right? Like you can pop a barrier between two bubbles, and like the two bubbles become one, right? So you can imagine, yeah, the universe is kind of this foam, all of the bubbles are experiences, or they're like agents, you could say. Donald Hoffman maybe would describe it that way. And the evolution of the universe is how these bubbles are locally either merging or separating from their local neighbors. You can also imagine, even enriching this a little bit, like, like each bubble maybe has a different type of gas inside. And so you can kind of like alchemically, or, well, I guess like with chemistry, you can create fascinating things by like popping and reuniting the bubbles in the right way, right? Like strategically, you mix these two, and then you mix these two, and then when you blend them, it turns into blue, or it turns into red, or something like that. And from this perspective, what the brain is doing is a kind of very sophisticated machine that is taking care of precisely popping these barriers and adding barriers between the bubbles in such a way that the big bubble that emerges actually has a structure that is good at predicting the physical environment of the organism. But the physical environment is itself also just made of a lot of bubbles, which is very hard to imagine.
So kind of like the integrated information theory perception, which is like there's this level. The only difference that they postulate that, or after a certain level, it collapses or like kind of like negates the other consciousnesses that it's made out of. But to me, more of a maybe kind of like a more of a modern Stephen Wolfram perception, which is like they can all coincide. So you can kind of have, the things that the smaller consciousnesses, they are the thing within itself, but also the thing that they make up also feels itself to be themselves to be as the thing within itself. But to me, honestly, it's completely coherent. Like I don't know where your intuition takes you there. So would that model, in theory, obviously, would allow to potentially in the future, if we have a really good mapping of this mechanism, because I can totally see I saw this example you gave it on the theory on the Toe podcast, which by the way was phenomenal. Everybody should go watch that with Kurt Jaimangal. The balloon thing when you spin it, if we map it properly and we find where we are with our perception in that, do you think that theoretically we could undo and like can you and I merge consciousnesses for a little bit and see each other's qualia? Would you say that's really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean that in the very hard scenario is where we might require something like a literal tube of neurons between our brains. Like I don't think, for example, Neuralink would do it. Like I don't think. Because you don't have the right medium of computation. I mean, essentially.
You're still computing within. Like you don't address where is it opening the gauge to somebody. But what if you have if you create an artificial medium? So like I create some kind of a space in which I can somehow project my attention, and then you can, like, we have a shared sandbox, let's say, something like that. Is that not possible in your mind?
I don't think so. I mean, it depends on whether like psychic effects are real, in which case like maybe this is already happening, right? But for that to be real, we need something more than standard physics, right? Like we need like, okay, maybe the etheric realm is true and the astral plane, and we have bodies in the astral plane, and that is the thing that is getting merged on high dose LSD when you blend with somebody. And I'm open to that, but what I'm saying is that if you fall by like the standard prosaic understanding, where like, and by that I mean even something like, well, maybe the brain is a quantum computer. I'm just saying like there isn't these kind of extra levels of reality you can rely on. I don't think, like meditating together, I don't think like, using some kind of digital interface will be enough. I think you literally would require like a biological tube that connects your brain from my brain, like a spinal cord that connects both of our brains and is alive and like, it's full of water and full of real biological neurons. That may actually be able to blend our consciousness, would be my guess. And probably like some topological engineering, like using transcranial magnetic stimulation and creating the electromagnetic fields just right so that you actually open the channel. But to me, it does sound like an engineering problem, because presumably life has solved it. I mean, like life is solving the problem of how to use your left and your right hemisphere to create a unified experience. Like there is like a way of doing it.
But maybe again, kind of like if we are thinking of life without anthropomorphizing too much, but like if we think of life kind of like doing a thing, some teleology that we can't understand, maybe it created things like us to actually solve higher level problems. So like, I don't know, to to protect itself from another meteor here, just like, hey, I'm going to make these things that might make a mess for a second, but then they'll be able to protect the biosphere or whatever. So that actually, by the way, this whole idea of the conundrum between quantum brain being a quantum computer or not quantum computer, actually some of the other possibility that I thought about in Core OR with Penrose's point about like the fact that we can know something to be true, but there's no way to compute it. Therefore, the brain is doing something else than computation. Just as easily, I can imagine that what if the brain, that part of the brain, is a quantum computer and it can compute laterally across the world, across the wave function, and it knows because it created a computation that your conscious self, which is regular computation, can't have access to, but the lateral computation does have access to it. That's why you know. So it's kind of like that's the separating line, and that's some other line. And maybe let's then do like a quick taste of this, like adjourn with this, and then we'll leave a taste for more for people if we should do this again. I do think it's a really important question, more than just a philosophical discussion, obviously, because of, we're starting to allocate serious funds towards these things. Yep. There's a point that and there's so much to be said about this. So I want to leave it to you to carry us out with there was a reason that you voiced that I really liked when you had a conversation with Michael Levin on the same panel, and it had to do with something along the lines of, from what I recall, that aside from the fact that the whole question of whether ChatGPT is conscious or not, what you said is that there's something. So first of all, what's probably optimizing for is way more than what we think it does, or completely different than what we think it does. And on our end of the user interface, it looks like just really coherent communication that understands everything we want and everything we are. But there's the vector space from which it's kind of sampling what it is doing for itself might be completely different. And it's probably just optimizing for kind of like the smoothness of the conversation. But there's another point that you made there. And it sounded along the same lines of what Michael Levin was saying with the fact that they saw that these super simple softwares also do these roundabouts that seem to be, like doing this weird thing in the background that nobody ordered, but it wasn't quite that. Can you recapitulate that point? Because like, what would be your strongest argument from everything that your intuition as to why most likely, we're not saying for sure because we don't really know, but most likely these things are not conscious or don't exhibit like anything near what we call consciousness? What would be your strongest arguments for that?
Yeah. I'll start by actually mentioning we have collected a comprehensive list of all the arguments pro and con, and it's one of the things we're actually fundraising for. And we've spent a good amount of time. It's the website, and we're looking for feedback, by the way. So if people want to dig into this, definitely send us feedback. We actually have like a prize system. If you give us really high quality feedback, we will financially compensate you. It's a cf-debate. .com, and it's like computational functionalism debate.com, and it lists a bunch of arguments. We have selected like 5 which we consider like key arguments, like very strong arguments. The central one for me, and the thing that changed my mind above all, is what's called like the binding problem, which is how is it possible that a system that is like spatially distributed can, in some sense, its state kind of like simultaneously contribute to a unified experience, like an experience that happens all at once. Our visual system, in a sense, like everything that you experience in your visual system, it is true that you're paying attention to kind of like one feature at a time. However, when you're paying attention to something, it is being contextualized by the field of awareness that is giving it meaning. So there really is kind of like no escaping the fact that consciousness has this feature, which is many pieces of information simultaneously present. Whereas if you look at a digital computer, there is nowhere in the computer where that information is actually aggregated. I mean, like what you can find is like, well, in this circuit, if I draw a boundary around that region and I consider that kind of like the place where the information converge, you can kind of make the story that, it come together. But then actually you look at it and you say like, well, but why not this boundary? Why not this boundary? There's nothing specific that actually makes drawing one boundary versus another boundary more natural in a digital computer.
So I'm interrupting. Isn't that also true about the brain, though? Like if you
Not
look from the
necessarily.
outside, just at the architect. No, okay.
Because if the brain is a nonlinear optical computer, there would actually be like topological boundaries in the electromagnetic field that actually
You can identify.
you can identify physically and would create an inside and an outside where everything inside is interacting and is not interacting with the outside. You're actually trapping energy, matter, information. This does not happen in a digital computer, not even close.
Is it something that you think we can recreate in silicon?
Yes, ultimately, not in strict silicon. I mean, the most likely path is going to be through like nonlinear optical computers, and it is something that I mean, I'm both fascinated by, but also concerned because I don't want us to create sentient entities that suffer for that we enslave for compute. The most likely path, though, is going to be via brain organoids, like literally people like creating biological tissue with neurons and hooking it up to digital computers, and then training them to solve, let's say, like image classification tasks, or like training them to play video games. And the results so far of like research, very cutting edge research on brain organoids suggest that they're able to do computation in a way that is more efficient than you would predict if these were just normal neurons. Like there's like another thing that is happening that is not just what's happening in a digital neural network. We suspect is actually field computing. They're like the brain organoids, they're not just neurons, they're neurons embedded in the electromagnetic field, and part of the computation is actually happening in the electromagnetic field, which is concerning because, yeah, that means you're actually using consciousness for compute.
I mean, it seems like it's what. Why is it? Why is the insistence? I'm not quite getting the. Why is the insistence on the organic substrate? Like, what is it about it that makes it uniquely well poised for this?
Yeah, because you have a dual relationship in causality between the low level kind of like rules, which is like, okay, like a neuron. I mean, this is well known neuroscience. Interestingly, over half of neuroscience PhDs don't know these, which is tells you something about like the dogmatic reductionism in academia. But it's true. I mean, like the what I would point to is like the MIT lab of Earl K. Miller. He's kind of like at the leading edge of like really proving this scientifically. And it goes as follows: that if you want to predict whether a neuron fires or not, a biological neuron fires or not, part of what predicts this is whether other neurons that are connected to it also fire, right? Like synaptic transmission or synaptic signaling. But this only predicts about like 40% of the variance. Like there's lots of cases where the neuron fires and it's like, well, there was nothing stimulating it. Why did it fire? And likewise the other way around. It turns out that like it really isn't just the synapses. There's something else that is contributing to this firing. There's a part that is just mysterious. Like there's like, is it random? Who knows? But there is a part that is known and is not neural activity, is field potential. What's called the local field potential of the tissue. And this is more than the sum of the parts. There's a very precise technical reason why this is the case, and that is that cell membranes effectively work as a low-pass filter for electrical signals. In other words, when a neuron is sensing the local field potential, is not the same as just kind of like, the average of activity of the surrounding. Is actually a filtered signal. There's already signal processing that is happening just through cell membranes that it can detect kind of like, hey, what is the average low frequency oscillations of my environment? And that feeds the probability that neuron fires. Now, on top of that, when a neuron fires, it affects the local field potential as well. So what you actually have is this like closed causal circuit where the state of the field affects the neurons and the neurons affect the state of the field. And so you actually require both to explain the behavior of biological tissue. And the field acts in this very unitary global way at the speed of light. I mean, it is something that is, you're kind of like tapping into the substrate of reality to be able to do that computation. Whereas in a digital computer, you literally spend so much effort in engineering into precisely avoiding any kind of like top-down influence of the field. Like you just want the transistors to respond to like the logic gates that are connected to it. Like if they fire, just because there's a lot of activity around, that's called like thermal noise, and this is something you don't want in digital computing. It doesn't mean that you cannot construct computers that do use electromagnetic field. It's just that they don't exist yet.
So the local potential field influences the possibility of a neuron, the action potential of each individual neuron.
Yeah.
This is different than that's what I thought the picture of neuroscientists had. Like there's this, you're saying no, that's the majority of neuroscientists kind of don't think about it that way, or half of them, like as you said.
Yeah. Like
really?
if you ask a random PhD student in neuroscience, in my experience, from Yale, Harvard, whatever, like doesn't matter. They're often surprised that that there's such a thing as local field potentials. They like all they have learned typically, and again, this is shocking to me, but I mean maybe things are changing, but this has been my experience. Is that they will say that hey, only the neurons matter. That like it's like when a neuron fires, is because there were like synapses that were going, influencing that neuron to fire.
Isn't another way of saying this, and this is, I'm putting it in front of you for correction if it's wrong, isn't another way of saying this is just that the average of all the action potentials as they are present in a particular neighborhood in the brain is the neighborhood local potential field? Like, isn't that's what it is? Isn't there just another way of talking about it?
No.
Okay.
The reason is because cell membranes effectively work as a low pass filter. So
there's always some buzz in the total, so to speak, that determines to a large degree also the behavior of an individual versus just looking at individuals collecting to the full.
Yeah, I'll give you an example, which is when there's a party next door and like it's very loud, and it's like like the music, and you hear the treble and you can't sleep, and so you close the door and you close the window, and then you only hear like boom, 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 right? Like you hear the bass. And that is because the bass can like sneak around, and like it can go like it's just much better at traveling through like the doors.
Okay. So there is an identifiably different signal that is more the unitary signal that isn't just the average of all the other ones. It's in
Correct.
addition to. Interesting. Okay. Wow. I actually also don't think I knew this.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a really comprehensive answer to this. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions from the audience that people want to ask. This one actually was interesting. Punkish87 from Discord is asking, I would love to hear if Andrés Gomez is aware of any mystical experiences facilitated not by psychedelics, but accepting and going into, quote unquote, the pain within cluster headache community. I am a chronic cluster head. They call themselves that. And I had the most vivid experience of being transported into a pain-free realm where I walked up a mountain with what I experienced as Buddha maybe. What Andrés is doing for the cluster community is truly a blessing. I really look forward to hearing your discussion. Okay, so do you open to this idea that it's possible to...
Yeah, a couple things. Well, first of all, yes, I really hope this person finds full relief, and yeah, I mean, for people who haven't heard of these, cluster headaches are some of the literally most painful thing you can have. Extreme suffering is not just pain; it's also extreme psychological suffering. So it's the whole thing is like as close to hell like as it gets for a human, and it's ridiculous that current prescribed medicine doesn't really work very well. Actually, chronically, it makes them worse. Like sumatriptan, for example, like it may work a little bit, but then it gives you more headaches and can give you heart attacks. And it's, the offer, well, oxygen works for a percentage of people. Super quick advice: if you have cluster headaches and you have oxygen, don't just like take a little bit of oxygen from like, a cannula in the nose. Like you actually need like a very big valve and kind of like like you need a lot of oxygen. That is what has a certain chance of aborting cluster headaches. For some reason, people are not educated on this by their doctors. Very tragic. But DMT is the one that seems to be really, really kind of a breakthrough here. We're talking about a significant percentage of patients, if they have a cluster headache and they smoke a little bit of DMT, even a very small amount, the pain goes from 10 out of 10 to like 1 out of 10 within 10 seconds. And hey, DMT is totally physically safe, right? So this is something you can do anytime you have a cluster headache. Anyway, the case is like super strong. And so like this is actually one of the things we are working towards. We have a website we're working on called clusterfree.org. Also, like, please send us feedback if you find anything there. But and yeah, tell your families and friends, because you don't know who might be struggling with cluster headaches. It's 1 in 1,000. Also, this also works for migraines, which are way more common. But yeah, people don't know this, but DMT can abort a migraine. So like that's definitely worth looking into. Okay, but now into the mechanism of action. So cluster headaches physiologically are very related to the inflammation of blood vessels very close to the trigeminal nerve. Usually it's just in one side. And it's kind of ridiculous that like, you just like press that nerve and it causes that level of pain. I mean, it's very unfortunate. We have like theories for like the mechanism, like the true mechanism of action based on like our research. But really that doesn't matter. Like what matters is that there's something that works, right? Like that is the thing that we're really pushing, is like, hey, like there's something that works. Let's go. Let's actually, go through FDA approvals. Let's make this happen. But I will say though that when I tried a DMT in 2024 at Eolucina retreat, which is this retreat in Mexico, which is the only place in the world where they treat people with severe headache disorders with psychedelics as like the value proposition of the retreat. I went there because I was very inspired by the people there. The founder, she had one of these disorders and cured it with psilocybin and DMT. Of course, it's part of my life mission to reduce as much suffering as I can. So for me, it was like a blessing. They welcomed me, and I spent a week there, hanging out, meeting people, and exploring DMT with a shaman over there. And you know what? Like, I had these visions where the benevolent entities, like, I mean, I went to these crazy Buddha lands in those ceremonies, and what they told me is like, okay, you know why DMT works for cluster headaches? Is because it allows the Buddha realms to form a karmic connection to you so that they can offload this electromagnetic knot that is the cluster headache, and they know how to process it and how to unfold it. And so it's actually some kind of like spiritual connection that is allowing the Buddhas to help you process that pain. Now, I don't know if this is true. I'm just saying, like, that's what they told me.
I mean, that's what he said in the comment. He even used the word Buddha, or I think that's what he meant to say. Wow, okay.
Yeah,
I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. You do feel like you have a rearranged head at the end of it. It's almost like a lot of the craziness just like...
Unnodding,
exactly, yeah. Absolutely. And especially with 5-MeO, also, it's like it just kind of like defragments your entire being, basically.
Exactly, but look, 5-MeO, and this is very important, 5-MeO doesn't seem to work for cluster headaches, right?
So, very important to, very important specifically.
But just to address his point specifically, I do not know of anybody who's achieved a mystical experience through focusing on a cluster headache. As far as I have always heard, it's just too intense. And like even advanced meditators, when they experience a cluster headache, they still suffer because it's too overwhelming. But I would love to interview this person if
he's part of our community in Core on Discord, so I'll ask him the specifics of this, and absolutely I'll tell him to reach out. I'll just have him email. Yeah,
super quick announcement too is like the cluster free initiative. We are also like requesting a video testimonial. So if you have tried DMT for cluster headaches and whether it works or it doesn't, please record a tiny video. And like, we intend to include it in a very heartwarming documentary to spread the word. So yes, I think that's important. So
people can find the details online, but if we're already here, let's give people like a quick, just a simple protocol there. So you're saying if you have a cluster headache coming on or a migraine, just smoke a little bit, sub-breakthrough, obviously, even sub-psychedelic dose, would you say? Just a little bit.
3 milligrams. So like 3 milligrams is 3 milligrams will work for a significant fraction of the people. Some people require more, and which is kind of scary because you're having so much pain and like do I really want to have like a crazy trip? Mm. But sometimes you have to trust, because like sometimes it really is like you just need to go a little bit higher and it will work. However, the protocol, as suggested by Bob Wold and people who have done this hundreds, thousands of times, is take a 5-second drag of a weak DMT pen. I mean, I'm sure you probably play with strong vape pens, so I don't know what a what a 5-second drag is, but probably pretty intense. But like take a little bit. Essentially, they say like take enough to the point that you feel a body vibration. Like that is the key. Like you feel the body buzz, and your vision a little bit of like vibrate. Usually, you don't need more. And if you need more, you can just wait 30 seconds or a minute and then take again like the same amount. And oftentimes, like you just repeating that a couple times is all you need. So like don't give up if it didn't work at first. And then in terms of protocols, like the for long-term relief, what they actually recommend is what they call like a busting protocol, which is every 3 weeks to have like a solid psychedelic experience with psilocybin or LSD. For psilocybin, it might be like anywhere between like half a gram and like 3 grams. You have to experiment and see what your body actually requires. And that is more of a kind of like a preventative thing. That is like, okay, you take psychedelics every 3 weeks to kind of like keep it at bay. And for a lot of people, that's all they need. But you have the DMT in case a cluster headache arises at any point. And importantly, sometimes a cluster headache may even arise during psilocybin. But if that happens, use DMT. And it actually is very likely that it will abort the cluster headache within the psilocybin space. So like DMT seems to be like more powerful and effective, but especially more as a kind of like an abortive. It also prevents, but for some reason, what they recommend is like this mixture of DMT for emergencies and psilocybin for kind of maintenance.
And you said this woman that was running the center, she cured it with psilocybin and DMT?
She suffers from a different thing called hemicrania continua, which is way less painful, but constant and never stops.
Like tinnitus, basically, just like always there kind of thing.
Exactly. Imagine like a painful tinnitus.
Ooh,
yeah,
man.
And so she describes it as kind of like Chinese torture. It's kind of like like a drop of water.
The drop, yeah, it's small. Okay, right.
And she is not that she doesn't have it anymore. Is that she has it fully controlled. So like she does it exactly like a psilocybin trip every 3 weeks, and she's fine. There's no problem there.
That is super helpful. All right, final question. David Carter is asking, well, I guess this question is more along the lines of what we're talking about, the relationship to the physicality, but it's specifically about your work. For Andres, with your work on visualizing psychedelic response mathematically, do you find any of the math you're exploring relevant in the non-psychedelic space, like physical or other phenomenon we could explore?
Yes. That is in some sense the whole pitch is the psychedelics are gonna like reveal the underlying dynamics, so that then you realize they have been here all along. It's just that the simulation the world simulation we inhabit is very well constructed, unless you have like mental illness, right? Like, usually people who have psychosis or have had schizophrenia usually have some insight that, oh my gosh, this is a world simulation because I saw it break down, right? For people who have never taken substances, have never meditated, have never had anything too wild, it's kind of hard to believe that what you're experiencing is like superposition of waves and resonant patterns and like the wave dynamics. It's just like, really? Like I'm just seeing the world. What are you talking about? But yeah, effectively the math of the systems of coupled oscillators and cell animation, nonlinear optics, liquid crystals, we think like that's actually what's implementing the world simulation to begin with. It's just that it's very finely tuned. Let me put it this way: like the different like visual rendering modules, there's some that are specialized in adding, for example, the like DMT-like patterns, but usually they're very well contained. So, for example, if you see my eyelashes or like the details of the hair, is like those modules. They're using those dynamics. But then maybe like the forehead or like the wall, the ceiling is this very broad area. So your brain uses another module to represent that. And kind of what happens on DMT, I would argue, is that all of the modules suddenly become like the high detail module, because all of them have like this coupled oscillator dynamics that are characteristic of the high frequency modules. It doesn't mean that there wasn't anything like that happening, but I think it does mean that it was compartmentalized and it was just playing a very specific role. Whereas maybe on DMT, you're just like all your body is forced to play that game.
It's all expressed as an individual component of your experience.
Yeah.
But that's a question I forgot to ask you when you were talking about it before. When you're presenting it to people without them taking anything, can it potentially induce even a remnants of the state? Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I mean, yes, not with the tool that we're going to release, but we have some even crazier, more advanced tools that are buggy and we're not ready to release them, and like for a bunch of reasons, but some of our most advanced tools, we're actually kind of careful about how to release them because anecdotally they kind of produce a transient HPPD. So like if you play with a tool for like a couple hours, for like a day or two, you actually have kind of like tracer effects and like you start to see.
I want to see that.
Okay, we've got a volunteer. Yes. Yeah. Well, as long as you're okay that as long as you're okay that it might be permanent. We don't know.
Oh, that's why can't you undo it then? It's like
Exactly.
Here's the dial, the other. Yeah.
That's also why I don't worry personally. Like.
Yeah.
It's. I mean, I play with these things all the time, and I'm fine. But people are different, and it is true. I mean, like, it is true that a lot of people get HPPD with psychedelics, and then they cure it with psychedelics. So it's interesting that I feel like a lot of people get stuck in HPPD because they become afraid, not realizing, hey, actually, you could fix this if you make your brain malleable again. So personally, I don't have like much worries because I've been through all these states. I've been through all the weird, unpleasant stuff. Like I know it's fine. I know how to process it. But yeah, it can be scary for sure when you encounter it for the first time. 100%.
It's not for the amateurs. Let's just put it.
Right. It's an extreme sport.
It's an extreme sport for sure. Andres, you're such a blessing, man. Truly, like you're a fountain of both wisdom, knowledge, and really interesting things to say. And I can't wait to see what else you guys make happen and advance no, for real, man. You really are one of my favorite thinkers. So hopefully we can do this again at some point and dive deeper into why everybody are wrong about computers being conscious. No,
yes,
no, it's we'll see. Well, I guess it will unfold, right? Dude, who knows, right? Who knows what's going to happen at this point? I've stopped being surprised. Let's just put it that way. Like at this point, I've stopped being surprised. So thank you so much for. Yeah,
do
go
you know
ahead.
what's gonna come out of my mouth next?
Not sure, actually. No.
Banana. I just wanted to say something you weren't gonna expect. That's all.
Oh, okay. Wait. This is because I stopped being surprised. Nice. There's a lot of explaining around the banana part. Did you see? I only thought of this because I literally titled it as bananas yesterday, but I saw Joe Rogan keep talking about it. The whole thing that all of a sudden AIs produce music that is actually like amazing, and I saw one that influenced me that way, and I was like, dude, the music industry is done. It's over. It's crazy. So. There's a big question about what the real meaning of everything is, but this is maybe a subject for another conversation, brother.
Yes.
Please keep doing what
much.
you're doing.
Thank you. I wanted to mention, I mean, also it's been super delightful talking about all of this. We haven't even covered anything having to do with the DMT and laser, but maybe by the next time we talk, maybe I will actually have seen it and actually experienced
I have
it,
to say that, like, and this is really, like, I know you haven't experienced it, and I understand. I first of all, I guess I'm moved by the fact that you still kind of like on it, because anybody else would just drop it. But there's something about what I'm saying that you think, okay, maybe I need to try more, and I appreciate that. But yeah, definitely there's some I'm made in the process of studying. I don't know if it's the right word, but like preparing for my conversation with you, it actually allowed me to consolidate a lot of my thoughts on these issues, because I needed to make them coherent to you to talk about them. And maybe by next time we talk, and probably for sure, I will have some more concrete things that I would love to see how you would tackle from the perspective of how you're investigating the world. I think there's really something there. But again, man, you thank you so much for everything you're doing and everything that you are. And here's for many, many more great things. It's going to be in the comments, but still, where can people find you and all that stuff?
Yeah, most important website is qri.org. My personal blog, which I write more speculative stuff, so you're more likely to be wrong. There is qualiacomputing.com. Collaborator, I would highly recommend smoothbrains.net, which is by Cube Flipper, close collaborator. And then if you want to tune into what we have done in terms of the psychedelic retreats, look into heart.qri.org. That's where we have like all of that content. And then finally, follow me on Twitter. I'm Alge Calypso, Captain Pleasure in Twitter.
That's amazing. All right, brother. Thank you so much, and we'll be in contact. Don't hang up, because this is Riverside. And